Imagine, if you will, a whispered conversation from nearly 2 millennia ago, a hushed debate amongst Roman legionaries packing up their gear, discussing the strange, mist-shrouded island they were abandoning. They're talking about Britannia, of course, a place they'd occupied for centuries, transforming parts of it with roads, villas, and baths, but ultimately finding it a bit too wild, too far-flung, and now, frankly, too much trouble. It's 410 AD, and the mighty Roman Empire, stretched thin by internal strife and barbarian incursions on its core territories, makes the fateful decision to withdraw its legions from this distant outpost. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I sincerely apologize for the annoying ads. They're a necessary evil to help support the channel's development and bring you more content like this. This departure wasn't a sudden dramatic exodus, mind you. It was more like a slow creaking withdrawal, a gradual unwinding of centuries of Roman influence, leaving behind a power vacuum as vast and unsettling as the British winter sky. Now, this isn't to say that all the Romans simply packed their bags and sailed away. Some had settled, intermarried, and their descendants undoubtedly remained, carrying on a diluted, fading echo of Roman ways. But the organized military and administrative structure, the very backbone of Roman control, was gone, leaving the Romano-British populace to fend for themselves against increasingly aggressive threats. They were no longer under the benevolent, if sometimes heavy, hand of Rome and the native Britons, who had, for generations, relied on Roman protection, now found themselves dangerously exposed. It's a bit like leaving your pampered house cat out in the wilderness after feeding it salmon for years. Sure, it might have some instincts, but the real world is a harsh teacher, and harsh it was. The Picts from the north, ever a thorn in Rome's side, and the Scotti from Ireland, began to raid with renewed ferocity, plundering settlements and carrying off captives. But the most significant threat, the one that would fundamentally reshape the island's identity, came from across the North Sea, the Anglo-Saxons. These were Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes primarily, who had, for some time, been making sporadic raids on the eastern and southern coasts of Britain. Initially, some Romano-British leaders, desperate for protection, invited these fierce warriors to serve as mercenaries, hoping to pit them against the northern raiders. Historians still argue whether this was a strategic masterstroke or an act of profound naivety. It seems, in retrospect, a bit like inviting a wolf into the sheepfold to protect against a fox. What began as a trickle of mercenary settlements soon became a flood of migration and conquest. Wave after wave of Anglo-Saxons arrived, driven by population pressures, a desire for new lands, and perhaps a touch of good old-fashioned wanderlust. They weren't just warriors. They were farmers, artisans, and families looking to build new lives. As they pushed westward, they encountered resistance from the native Britons, leading to a long and brutal period of conflict. This wasn't a quick, decisive war, but a piecemeal, grinding struggle, fought village by village, field by field. The archaeological record shows evidence of destruction and abandonment of Roman sites, replaced by distinct Anglo-Saxon settlements, often with entirely new place names. It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? How the names of our towns and rivers can tell us stories of ancient conquests. Think of places ending in ton, town, or ham, homestead. Those are often Anglo-Saxon fingerprints. The Britons, despite their initial Romanization, were largely disunited, lacking a centralized authority to effectively counter the organized, if disparate, Anglo-Saxon forces. Legends, of course, speak of figures like King Arthur, a heroic leader who supposedly united the Britons and held back the invaders. But concrete historical evidence for his existence remains elusive, lost in the mists of time and the fires of war. Still, the idea of a noble, embattled king leading his people against overwhelming odds certainly makes for a better bedtime story than simply, and then they were conquered, doesn't it? The Britons were gradually pushed westward into what we now know as Wales, Cornwall, and parts of Scotland, their language and culture surviving in these more remote, defensible areas. The ancient Brythonic tongue, once widespread, contracted significantly, giving way to the developing Old English of the newcomers. The Anglo-Saxons, meanwhile, didn't arrive as a single unified force. They were distinct tribes with their own leaders and customs, and as they settled, they established a series of independent kingdoms across the land. This period saw the emergence of what historians later termed the Heptarchy, a slightly misleading term meaning 7 kingdoms, as the number and power of these kingdoms fluctuated constantly. You had mighty Northumbria in the north, stretching from coast to coast, Mercia in the Midlands, a powerful, often aggressive force, East Anglia on the eastern coast, and in the south, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, and Kent. Each of these kingdoms vied for dominance, engaging in alliances, betrayals, and endless skirmishes, all trying to establish themselves as the Bretwalda, or Britain ruler, a kind of overlord who held sway over the others. It was a bit like a medieval game of Risk, only with more actual blood and slightly less strategy, perhaps. The landscape, once crisscrossed by Roman roads, began to revert in places to wild woodland and marsh, interspersed with these new, often palisaded, Anglo-Saxon villages and halls. Life became more localized, more agricultural, and certainly less cosmopolitan than under Roman rule. But a distinct new culture, one that would become the foundation of England, was slowly, inexorably, beginning to take root in the soil. As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms solidified their grip on the land, carving out territories and defending their borders with a ferocity that would make a modern-day homeowners association meeting look like a tea party. The spiritual landscape of Britain was also undergoing a profound transformation. Before the arrival of Roman Christianity, the native Britons had practiced various forms of paganism, often centered around natural forces, sacred groves, and mysterious deities, elements that still echo in some of our folk tales today. The Romans, when they arrived, brought Christianity with them, and for a time it coexisted with, or sometimes superseded, the older beliefs, especially in urban centers. But with the Roman withdrawal and the subsequent Anglo-Saxon invasions, much of this early Christian presence in the newly formed Anglo-Saxon kingdoms faded, replaced by the polytheistic Germanic paganism of the newcomers, a religion rich with gods like Woden, Thuna, and Tu, whose names, interestingly enough, still grace our days of the week: Wednesday, Thursday, and Tuesday. Imagine 1,000 years ago, someone arguing about the best day for a feast, perhaps saying, "Well, Thunos Day sounds like it'll bring a good storm for the crops, doesn't it?" Yet even as Anglo-Saxon paganism held sway, the seeds of Christianity, though seemingly trampled, were not entirely eradicated. In the western reaches, particularly in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, Celtic Christianity continued to thrive, developing its own unique practices and monastic traditions, often distinct from the Roman form. These Celtic monks were, in their own way, incredibly hardy individuals, not just content with quiet contemplation, but often embarking on daring missionary journeys in small coracles, bringing their faith to distant shores. You could say they were the original influencers, just without the fancy cameras and sponsored content. The true turning point for the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons, however, came from a different direction: Rome itself. In 597 AD, Pope Gregory the Great, observing a group of fair-haired Angle slaves in the Roman marketplace, and reputedly remarking that they were not Angles but angels, dispatched a mission led by Augustine of Canterbury. Augustine and his fellow monks landed in Kent, a kingdom with existing ties to continental Europe, and conveniently, a pagan king, Ethelbert, whose Frankish wife, Bertha, was already a Christian. This was a rather shrewd move by the Pope, essentially sending his missionaries to a place where they already had a foot in the door. It wasn't long before Ethelbert, swayed by Augustine's preaching, and perhaps by his wife's quiet influence, converted to Christianity, setting a crucial precedent for the rest of England. From Kent, the faith began to spread, though not without considerable resistance and setbacks. It was a slow, often violent process, a spiritual tug-of-war between the old gods and the new. Kings might convert, then apostatize, or their pagan successors might revert to the old ways, leading to periods of backsliding and renewed missionary efforts. Sometimes, it was a practical decision. Converting to Christianity could offer political advantages, fostering alliances with powerful Christian kingdoms on the continent. Other times, it was a genuine spiritual conviction. Imagine the tension in a royal hall as a pagan king listens to a monk describe a single, all-powerful God, vastly different from the pantheon of gods he'd worshipped since childhood. It would be quite a conversation. Simultaneously, the influence of Celtic Christianity, remember that, was also pushing eastward from the north. Monks from Iona, a monastery founded by the Irish Saint Columba, established the influential monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria. Figures like St. Aidan brought a fervent, ascetic brand of Christianity to the powerful kingdom of Northumbria, converting kings like Oswald. This created a fascinating dynamic, with two distinct forms of Christianity, Roman and Celtic, vying for supremacy within England. Their differences weren't about fundamental dogma, but about practices: the date of Easter, the style of monastic tonsure that haircut monks had, and certain liturgical traditions. It might seem trivial now, but back then, these were matters of intense debate, almost like arguing over the correct way to load a dishwasher. Vital to some, baffling to others, the tension between these two traditions finally came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD. King Oswiu of Northumbria, himself caught between the two practices, convened this council to decide which tradition his kingdom would follow. After much debate, famously featuring arguments from figures like Wilfrid for the Roman side and Colman for the Celtic, Oswiu ultimately sided with Rome. His reasoning was rather pragmatic, perhaps even a touch humorous. He was told that Peter, the apostle, held the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and he didn't want to risk upsetting the gatekeeper. This decision was pivotal, as it meant that England would largely align itself with the Roman Church, integrating it more fully into the wider Christian European world and strengthening the eventual concept of a unified English identity. The establishment of bishoprics and monasteries followed, becoming centers of learning, culture, and governance, as well as spiritual life. Monasteries like Wearmouth and Jarrow, home to the venerable scholar Bede, became beacons of intellectual activity, preserving knowledge and producing illuminated manuscripts that are still breathtaking to behold. These institutions weren't just places for prayer. They were powerhouses, influencing kings, educating the elite, and acting as economic hubs. The church, with its hierarchical structure and transnational connections, provided a new unifying force, a shared cultural framework that transcended the squabbling Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It began to weave together the disparate threads of Anglo-Saxon life into a more cohesive tapestry, setting the stage for the next great challenge that would test the very fabric of this nascent English society. Just as the fragile tapestry of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was beginning to coalesce under the unifying influence of Christianity, and the kings were starting to get comfortable on their somewhat rickety thrones, a new and terrifying force emerged from across the sea, bringing with it a chill wind of fear and the smell of salt and smoke. The Vikings. Imagine, if you will, the quiet morning calm of a monastery on the coast, perhaps Lindisfarne. Remember that spiritual beacon suddenly shattered by the blood-curdling roar of foreign tongues and the glint of axes. It's 793 AD, and this brutal raid on Lindisfarne, often considered the beginning of the Viking Age in England, wasn't just a shock. It was a devastating psychological blow, a stark reminder that even God's own houses weren't safe. These weren't just ordinary raiders. They were pagan warriors, seemingly without mercy, striking fear into the hearts of a Christianized land. It must have felt like the end of days for many. Initially, these were sporadic raids, swift and brutal hit-and-run attacks on coastal monasteries and wealthy settlements, designed to snatch treasures and disappear before any effective resistance could be mounted. These Norsemen, hailing from what we now call Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, were exceptional seafarers, their longships cutting through the waves with terrifying speed, allowing them to strike anywhere along the vulnerable coastline. It was like dealing with a swarm of highly motivated, extremely well-armed mosquitoes. Only these mosquitoes brought fire and swords. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, accustomed to squabbling among themselves, found themselves ill-prepared for this new existential threat. Their defenses were localized, their armies often slow to muster, and their naval capabilities virtually non-existent compared to the Viking fleets. As the 9th century progressed, the Viking threat evolved from mere raiding to large-scale invasion and settlement. What started as summer campaigns became year-round occupations, with the Vikings establishing permanent bases from which to launch deeper incursions. In 865 AD, a massive force, later dubbed the Great Heathen Army by Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, landed in East Anglia. This was no raiding party. This was a formidable military force led by legendary figures such as Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, intent on conquest and settlement. They systematically ravaged kingdom after kingdom. East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia all fell under their brutal sway. They plundered, they conquered, and they settled, pushing the Anglo-Saxon inhabitants westward, establishing what became known as the Danelaw, a vast area in eastern and northern England where Danish law and customs prevailed. It was as if a significant chunk of modern-day England suddenly became a Scandinavian colony, complete with its own language nuances and legal traditions, though perhaps with fewer flat-pack furniture stores. Amidst this relentless onslaught, one Anglo-Saxon kingdom stood as the last bastion of resistance, Wessex. And within Wessex, one figure would rise to become the unlikely savior of Anglo-Saxon England, Alfred the Great. Imagine him, holed up in the marshes of Athelney, a king on the run, seemingly defeated, yet nurturing a spark of defiance. Tales tell of him burning a peasant woman's cakes while lost in thought, a moment that humanizes this legendary figure and reminds us that even heroes have off days, especially when distracted by existential threats to their kingdom. He wasn't just a warrior king, he was a scholar, a lawgiver, and a strategist, recognizing that mere military might wouldn't be enough to repel the Vikings. Alfred set about reforming his kingdom from the ground up. He reorganized the army, creating a rotating militia system, ensuring a constant force was available for defense without crippling the agricultural economy. He built fortified settlements called burhs, a network of strongholds designed to protect the populace and provide bases for his forces. These burhs weren't just simple forts. They were often thriving towns, designed to be defensible and to foster trade, showing a remarkable foresight for urban planning in a tumultuous age. He also recognized the importance of naval power, commissioning the construction of larger ships to counter the Viking fleets, marking an early step in what would one day become a global maritime power. And he knew that a strong state needed a strong culture. He promoted education, translating important Latin texts into Old English, ensuring that knowledge wouldn't be lost amidst the chaos. He essentially decided that if England was going to survive, it needed both swords and scrolls. The turning point came in 878 AD at the Battle of Edington. After a surprise attack forced Alfred to retreat to Athelney, he emerged with his reconstituted forces and decisively defeated the great heathen army under the command of Guthrum. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a psychological triumph, a clear signal that the Anglo-Saxons could, in fact, fight back and win. Following the victory, Alfred negotiated the Treaty of Wedmore with Guthrum, which formalized the division of England, the Danelaw in the east under Viking rule, and Anglo-Saxon Wessex and its client kingdoms in the west. It wasn't a complete expulsion, but it was a crucial containment, preventing the complete subjugation of England. Alfred's reign laid the foundations for a truly unified English kingdom. He established a reputation for justice, wisdom, and resilience, earning him the epithet the Great, a title rarely bestowed upon English monarchs. He essentially put England on the path to nationhood, demonstrating that even in the darkest of times, with seemingly insurmountable odds, strong leadership and a clear vision could turn the tide. His legacy extended beyond military victories. He fostered a sense of shared English identity, a common purpose, laying the groundwork for his successors to continue the slow, arduous process of reclaiming the Danelaw and forging a single English crown. The echoes of his reforms, from military organization to legal principles, would resonate for centuries, proving that sometimes the greatest defense isn't just about swinging a sword, but about building a better society. After Alfred the Great, remember him, the cake-burning, Viking-slaying king who saved Wessex from oblivion. The momentum for a unified England truly began to build. His successors, the kings of Wessex, inherited not just a kingdom, but a vision, the reclamation of the Danelaw and the forging of a single Anglo-Saxon realm. Imagine the long, arduous process, a slow reclaiming of territory, piece by piece, like knitting a huge, complex tapestry after someone's pulled out a quarter of the threads. It wasn't a single dramatic conquest, but a sustained campaign that stretched over decades, often characterized by strategic fortress building, diplomatic maneuvering, and yes, plenty of pitched battles. Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, continued his father's policies with remarkable success. He, along with his formidable sister, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, Now there's a title that just oozes power, doesn't it? Systematically pushed back against the Viking strongholds. Ethelfled, in particular, was an extraordinary figure for her time, a female military leader and strategist who commanded armies, built burhs, and effectively governed Mercia. It's a compelling thought. A woman, in the early 10th century, holding her own against Viking warlords and male Anglo-Saxon kings, proving that leadership isn't just about brawn. She recaptured Derby and Leicester from the Danes, expanding Anglo-Saxon control and demonstrating a strategic brilliance that rivaled any king. Her death in 918 AD saw Mercia absorbed into the direct rule of Wessex, further consolidating the kingdom. Edward the Elder continued the push, and by his death, much of England south of the Humber was under direct Anglo-Saxon control. His son, Aethelstan, who reigned from 925 to 939 AD, is often considered the first true King of England. He went even further than his predecessors, not just reclaiming territory, but asserting dominance over the other British rulers, including the Welsh, Scots, and Strathclyde Britons. His greatest triumph came in 937 AD at the Battle of Brunanburh, a monumental clash against a combined force of Scots, Strathclyde Britons, and Vikings from Dublin. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a contemporary historical record, describes it with almost epic poetry. A truly brutal and decisive victory that cemented Ethelstan's reputation and the nascent English kingdom's power. Historians still argue whether the exact location of Brunanburh has been found, but its significance as a moment of English national identity is undisputed. Under Aethelstan and his immediate successors, such as Edgar the Peaceful, who reigned in the latter half of the 10th century, England enjoyed a period of relative stability and prosperity. This was the golden age of Anglo-Saxon England, a time of flourishing monasticism, impressive artistic production, particularly in manuscript illumination and metalwork, and the development of a sophisticated administrative system. The kingdom was divided into shires, which were further subdivided, and royal authority, though still somewhat decentralized, was gaining strength. They even had a standardized currency, which, let's be honest, makes life a whole lot easier for everyone, whether you're a king or a humble farmer trying to buy a particularly fluffy sheep. However, this period of relative calm was not destined to last. As the new millennium approached, a familiar threat re-emerged from across the North Sea. But this time, it was different. The Viking raids of the late 10th century were not just random plundering. They were organized, large-scale campaigns, often led by powerful Scandinavian kings seeking tribute and eventually conquest. These weren't the disorganized warbands of the past. These were professional armies. The king who faced this renewed onslaught was Ethelred II, famously, or perhaps infamously, known as Ethelred the Unready. Now, that epithet, unready, doesn't mean he was unprepared in the modern sense of the word. It's a mistranslation of the Old English unread, meaning no counsel or ill-advised, implying he was poorly advised or made poor decisions. And unfortunately for Ethelred, the historical record suggests he often did. His reign, which spanned from 978 to 1016 AD, was largely characterized by a series of disastrous attempts to repel the Danes. Instead of fighting them head-on, Ethelred often resorted to paying vast sums of tribute, known as Danegeld, to the Viking leaders in exchange for peace. It was a strategy born of desperation, a bit like trying to pay off a persistent housefly with tiny bits of sugar. It might work for a moment, but it ultimately just attracts more flies. While it sometimes brought temporary respite, it only encouraged further attacks. As the Danes quickly learned that England was a rich source of easy money, imagine the frustration of the ordinary English farmer, toiling away, only to have a significant portion of his hard-earned produce taken to pay off invaders who would just come back next year. The situation escalated dramatically. In 1002, Ethelred, in a moment of panic and perhaps poor judgment, ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre, a widespread killing of Danes living in England. This act of ethnic cleansing was a monumental blunder, providing a potent justification for full-scale invasion by the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, whose sister was among those killed. Sweyn launched a devastating campaign that brought England to its knees. Ethelred eventually fled to Normandy, leaving England to be conquered by Sweyn. Though Sweyn died shortly after, his son Nut, later known as Nut the Great, completed the conquest. After a complex series of struggles, including Ethelred's brief return and death, Nut emerged victorious in 1016, becoming King of England. This marked a profound shift. England, forged under Anglo-Saxon kings, now found itself ruled by a Dane. Nut, however, proved to be a surprisingly effective and benevolent ruler, at least for a Viking conqueror. He managed a vast North Sea empire, encompassing England, Denmark, and Norway, and brought a period of peace and stability to England after years of turmoil. He even went on a pilgrimage to Rome, a sign of his embrace of Christian kingship. It was a bizarre twist of fate, but under Canute, England, for a time, was a part of a powerful Scandinavian empire, showing just how fluid and interconnected the medieval world truly was. This set the stage for yet another complex succession crisis, one that would, in time, lead to an event that forever changed the course of English history. Nut the Great, the Viking king, who had made England the jewel in his North Sea empire, passed away in 1035, and as often happens when a strong ruler departs the stage, his empire, much like a poorly constructed Jenga tower, began to wobble precariously. His sons squabbled over the succession, leading to a period of instability and brief reigns that felt more like musical chairs than stable monarchy. After a few short years of this uncertainty, the Anglo-Saxon line was briefly restored to the throne with the accession of Edward the Confessor in 1042. Imagine the collective sigh of relief, or perhaps a skeptical shrug, from the English nobility. A return to the old ways, a son of Ethelred, the Unready, no less. Edward was a pious and rather ascetic king, more interested in saints and spiritual matters than the rough and tumble politics of ruling. He spent much of his youth in exile in Normandy, and this Norman upbringing would prove to be a crucial, indeed catastrophic, detail for England's future. He had no children, and this lack of an heir became the ticking time bomb at the heart of his reign. As Edward grew older, the question of succession became increasingly urgent, a persistent hum in the background of courtly life that would eventually explode into outright conflict. Various powerful figures jostled for position, each with their own claims or ambitions. The most prominent and powerful English magnate was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, a man of immense wealth, military prowess, and considerable political skill. He was, in essence, the power behind the throne, administering the kingdom effectively, while the king focused on his spiritual devotions, including the building of Westminster Abbey. Harold was, by many accounts, a strong, capable leader, exactly the kind of man England needed after years of Viking disruption and royal uncertainty. He even claimed that Edward, on his deathbed, had named him as his successor, a deathbed promise that, conveniently for Harold, no one else could definitively contradict. However, Harold was not the only contender, nor was his claim undisputed. Far across the English Channel, in the Duchy of Normandy, lived William, Duke of Normandy. William was a formidable figure, a ruthless and ambitious leader who had clawed his way to power and held onto it with an iron grip. He was also a distant cousin of Edward the Confessor, and crucially, he claimed that Edward had, years earlier, promised him the English throne during Harold Godwinson's visit to Normandy. Now, this is where things get really murky and wonderfully medieval, isn't it? Did Harold swear an oath of fealty to William, promising to support his claim? Was he forced into it? Historians still argue whether Harold genuinely committed to William's claim, or if he was coerced while shipwrecked in Normandy. Whatever the truth, William certainly believed he had a legitimate claim, and was not one to let such an opportunity slip through his fingers. He had a reputation for getting what he wanted, by fair means or foul. Adding another layer to this already crowded field of claimants was Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. He too believed he had a legitimate claim to the English throne through an earlier agreement between Cnut's son and a previous Norwegian king. Harald Hardrada was a legendary Viking warrior, often described as the last great Viking, a man who had seen battle across Europe, from Scandinavia to Byzantium. He was a force to be reckoned with, and he wasn't about to let an opportunity for conquest pass him by. It's like a medieval reality TV show, with 3 alpha males vying for the grand prize of England. When Edward the Confessor finally died in January 1066, the stage was set for one of the most pivotal years in English history. The Witan, the council of leading Anglo-Saxon nobles, immediately elected Harold Godwinson as king, crowning him swiftly in Westminster Abbey. This rapid coronation was likely an attempt to present a united front and preempt any challenges. For a brief moment, it seemed Harold had secured the crown, but William of Normandy was not one to be easily deterred. He immediately began planning his invasion, meticulously gathering ships, supplies, and an army composed of Normans, Bretons, Flemings, and mercenaries from across Europe. He also shrewdly secured the blessing of the Pope, portraying his invasion as a holy crusade against a perjurer, Harold, who he claimed broke his oath, and a corrupt English church. Meanwhile, Harald Hardrada, in alliance with Harold Godwinson's disgruntled brother, Tostig Godwinson, launched his own invasion of northern England. This was a stroke of strategic genius for William, or perhaps just incredibly good timing, as it forced Harold Godwinson to make an agonizing choice. Harold, despite his relatively new kingship, acted with astonishing speed and decisiveness. He marched his army, composed largely of foot soldiers, over 185 miles north in just a few days, covering ground that would make modern logistics teams weep. On September 25th, 1066, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold's English forces completely annihilated the Norwegian invasion force. Harald Hardrada was killed, along with Tostig, and the Viking threat to England was, for all intents and purposes, finally ended. It was an incredible victory, a testament to Harold's leadership and the endurance of his men. Imagine the relief, the sheer exhaustion, and the brief moment of triumph that must have swept through the English camp. However, this victory came at a terrible cost. Just days later, on September 28th, William of Normandy landed unopposed at Pevensey Bay in Sussex, having waited patiently for the opportune moment. Harold received the devastating news while still in the north, exhausted from battle. He immediately turned his weary army south, embarking on another forced march, knowing that the fate of England rested on his shoulders. He could have waited, gathered more men, rested his fatigued troops, but perhaps he feared allowing William to establish a stronger foothold or doubted his ability to raise more levies. Historians still argue whether this hasty march was a tactical error that sealed his fate, or the only viable option given the circumstances. On October 14th, 1066, Harold's exhausted army confronted William's well-rested and heavily armored Norman forces at the Battle of Hastings. The battle was a brutal, all-day affair, a grinding struggle between the English shield wall and the Norman cavalry and archers. The English fought bravely, repelling repeated Norman charges, but eventually, after feigned retreats and relentless archery volleys, the shield wall began to crack. Harold himself was killed, famously, perhaps, by an arrow to the eye, or perhaps by Norman knights hacking him down. With their king dead, the English resistance collapsed. William's victory at Hastings was total and decisive. He then marched on London, receiving the submission of the remaining English magnates, and on Christmas Day 1066, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the very church Edward the Confessor had built. The Norman conquest was not just a change of kings. It was a fundamental shift in England's entire social, political, and cultural fabric, profoundly impacting everything from language and law to land ownership and architecture. The Anglo-Saxon era, with its rich culture and ancient traditions, had abruptly come to a violent end, ushering in a new Norman-French-dominated age. It's a remarkable example of how a single battle on a single day can utterly transform a nation forever. With William the Conqueror crowned king on Christmas Day 1066, a new chapter in England's story began. But it wasn't exactly a harmonious transition. Imagine the collective grumbling, perhaps even outright rebellion, from the Anglo-Saxon elite who had just seen their king fall, and a foreign invader seize the throne. William's conquest was, by no means, a universally accepted event. It was a brutal takeover, and he spent the next few years ruthlessly consolidating his power, effectively putting down numerous rebellions across the land. This wasn't a gentleman's agreement. It was a military occupation. He crushed dissent with an iron fist, earning himself a rather fearsome reputation. For instance, the infamous Harrying of the North in 1069-70 saw William devastate vast swathes of northern England to suppress local uprisings, leading to widespread famine and death. It was a scorched earth policy designed to break the spirit of resistance, and it certainly worked, albeit at a terrible human cost. One can almost hear the desperate whispers of the surviving Anglo-Saxons hiding in the ruins of their homes, wondering if the world had simply turned upside down. The most significant and lasting impact of the Norman conquest was the complete overhaul of England's existing social and political structures, effectively replacing the Anglo-Saxon elite with a new Norman aristocracy. William immediately embarked on a systematic process of land confiscation, seizing the estates of Anglo-Saxon nobles who had fought against him at Hastings, or who subsequently rebelled. These vast tracts of land were then redistributed to his loyal Norman followers, creating a new landed gentry entirely beholden to the king. This was feudalism, Norman style, imposed from the top down with breathtaking efficiency. The English peasantry, the vast majority of the population, found their old Anglo-Saxon lords replaced by Norman overlords, often speaking a different language and bringing with them different customs. It must have felt like a massive corporate takeover, only with more swords and less severance pay. This new feudal system wasn't just about land ownership. It was a hierarchical pyramid of loyalty and service. At the very top was the king, who theoretically owned all the land. He granted large parcels, known as fiefs or baronies, to his most trusted Norman barons in exchange for military service, knights, counsel, and financial aid. These barons, in turn, subgranted portions of their land to lesser knights and vassals who owed them similar services. At the bottom of this pyramid were the peasants, or serfs, who were tied to the land, working for their lord in exchange for protection and a place to live. It was a highly organized system, designed to ensure loyalty and military readiness, but it also meant that power was incredibly concentrated in the hands of a few. Historians still argue whether the English feudal system was a direct import from Normandy or a more complex adaptation of existing Anglo-Saxon structures. But its impact on medieval English society was undeniable. One of William's most extraordinary achievements, and perhaps one of the most remarkable administrative feats of the entire medieval period, was the commissioning of the Domesday Book. Imagine, if you will, thousands of royal commissioners fanning out across England, knocking on every door, asking about every single piece of land, every pig, every plough, every person. Completed in 1086, this massive survey was a comprehensive inventory of all land and property in England, detailing who owned what its value was, what resources it had, and what taxes it had paid before the conquest. It was, in essence, a giant spreadsheet of the entire kingdom, an unparalleled record of medieval life. The very name Domesday derives from the Anglo-Saxon word for doom or judgment, reflecting the absolute and unappealable nature of its findings, much like the final judgment of God. Why did William undertake such a monumental task? Primarily, it was for practical reasons: to assess his new kingdom's wealth, to ensure proper taxation, and to understand the resources available for military service. He needed to know exactly what he had conquered and what he could extract from it. It also served to legitimize his rule, as it provided a clear and undeniable record of ownership, confirming the new Norman landholdings. It was a statement of absolute control, a tangible manifestation of his conquest, proving that every corner of England was now under his watchful eye. For modern historians, it's an invaluable snapshot of 11th century England, providing insights into demographics, land use, and economic structures that would otherwise be lost to time. The Norman influence wasn't just about land and power. It permeated nearly every aspect of English life. Latin became the language of the church and official documents, while Norman French became the language of the court, the aristocracy, and the law. For centuries, England effectively became a trilingual nation, with Old English, which evolved into Middle English, spoken by the common people, French by the elite, and Latin by the learned. This linguistic blend explains why modern English has so many words of French origin, particularly in areas related to government, law, and high culture. Think of words like parliament, justice, jury, beef, from beef, and pork, from pork, all French imports. Meanwhile, the humble English pig, still rooted in the land, kept its Anglo-Saxon name. It's a subtle but persistent reminder of that cultural fusion, or perhaps collision. Culturally, the Normans brought with them their own architectural styles, particularly in castle building. The timber and earth motte and bailey castles of the Anglo-Saxons were gradually replaced by massive stone keeps, imposing structures designed for defense and to project Norman power. These castles, strategically placed across the landscape, were not just military strongholds. They were symbols of foreign domination, stark reminders to the local populace of who was in charge now. They also introduced new legal concepts and administrative practices, grafting them onto existing Anglo-Saxon customs, creating a complex but ultimately more robust system of governance. By the time William the Conqueror died in 1087, his conquest was complete. He had transformed England from a collection of Anglo-Saxon shires into a powerful, centralized Norman kingdom, firmly integrated into the political and cultural orbit of continental Europe. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was largely gone, replaced by a new French-speaking elite. The structures he put in place, from the feudal system to the Domesday Book, would shape England for centuries to come, laying the groundwork for its future development as a unified nation, though perhaps not one that would completely forget its Anglo-Saxon roots. The seeds of future conflicts, of course, were also sown in this turbulent period, as the new Norman rulers struggled to maintain control over their vast new domain and their own rebellious barons. After the iron grip of William the Conqueror, whose shadow loomed large even after his death in 1087, the Kingdom of England, now firmly Norman, entered a period where the succession wasn't always as smooth as a freshly planned oak beam. William had 3 sons, and like any good family drama, they immediately began squabbling over their inheritance. His eldest, Robert Curthose, inherited Normandy, while his second surviving son, William II, known as Rufus, became King of England. Rufus was a controversial figure, known for his harsh rule, his extravagant lifestyle, and his frequent conflicts with the church. He wasn't exactly a people person, nor was he particularly pious. Imagine a king who enjoyed hunting more than praying, and whose temper was as fiery as his red hair. His reign was marked by struggles to assert his authority over rebellious barons and his brother Robert. Historians still argue whether William Rufus was truly a tyrannical ruler or simply misunderstood in a turbulent age. His mysterious death in 1100, shot by an arrow during a hunting trip in the New Forest, remains one of medieval England's enduring unsolved mysteries. Was it an accident? Or was it a convenient assassination? We'll never truly know. But the timing was certainly fortuitous for his younger brother. That younger brother was Henry I, William the Conqueror's youngest son, who swiftly seized the throne upon Rufus's death, bypassing their elder brother Robert. Henry was a shrewd and intelligent ruler, often called Beauclerk, for his education and administrative abilities. He understood the need for stability and sought to reconcile the Norman and Anglo-Saxon elements of his kingdom. He even married Matilda of Scotland, a descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, a union that was symbolic, if not always entirely unifying, effectively blending the two bloodlines. He strengthened royal administration, developed the exchequer, the treasury, and established a more organized legal system. Henry's reign brought a much-needed period of relative peace and effective governance after the tumult of his brothers' reigns. He was the kind of king who probably enjoyed a good spreadsheet, or at least the medieval equivalent, far more than a jousting tournament. However, Henry III's carefully constructed peace was shattered by a tragic turn of events. In 1120, his only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the infamous White Ship disaster while crossing the English Channel. Imagine the king's despair, seeing his entire dynastic plan sink to the bottom of the sea. This left Henry without a male heir, a catastrophic blow in an age where male succession was paramount. Desperate, Henry made his daughter, Matilda, who was also the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor, hence her grand title of Empress Matilda, his designated heir. He forced his barons to swear oaths of fealty to her, a revolutionary concept given that a woman had never ruled England in her own right. Predictably, this did not sit well with many of the powerful, misogynistic Norman barons, who probably grumbled about it over their tankards of ale, even as they swore their oaths with fingers crossed behind their backs. When Henry the Thorny died in 1135, the precarious succession plunged England into a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy. Despite their oaths to Matilda, many barons reneged on their promises, preferring a male ruler. Her cousin, Stephen of Blois, a popular and charismatic figure, quickly seized the throne. Now Stephen was, by many accounts, a decent man, but he lacked the ruthless determination of a true conqueror, and he struggled to assert his authority in a kingdom where the barons were increasingly acting like independent warlords. It was a bit like trying to herd cats, only these cats had castles and private armies. Empress Matilda, however, was not one to back down. She was a formidable woman, intelligent and tenacious, who had no intention of relinquishing her claim. With the support of her half-brother, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, she launched her own invasion of England in 1139, sparking a brutal and protracted civil war that lasted nearly 2 decades. The land descended into chaos. Barons built illegal castles, plundered the countryside, and switched allegiances with alarming frequency, often based on who offered the best deal or who was currently winning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, reflecting the misery of the time, famously lamented that Christ and his saints were asleep during this period, a poignant image that speaks volumes about the suffering endured by ordinary people. The Anarchy was a period of widespread suffering, lawlessness, and economic collapse. Fields lay fallow, villages were plundered, and trade routes became unsafe. The central authority of the crown, so carefully built up by Henry I, disintegrated. Both Matilda and Stephen were strong-willed individuals, but neither could secure a decisive victory, leading to a weary stalemate. Matilda was often perceived as arrogant and aloof, alienating potential supporters, while Stephen, though more genial, was often indecisive and struggled to maintain control over his unruly magnates. It was a classic case of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object, with the common people caught tragically in the middle. The turning point finally came when Stephen's eldest son and heir, Eustace, died in 1153. This removed a major obstacle to a peaceful resolution. Exhausted by years of war, Stephen and Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, reached an agreement known as the Treaty of Winchester, also sometimes called the Treaty of Wallingford or Westminster. Under this treaty, Stephen would remain king for the remainder of his life, but Henry Plantagenet was recognized as his heir. It was a pragmatic solution, allowing a semblance of peace to return and ensuring a clear, albeit delayed, succession. When Stephen died in 1154, as per the agreement, Henry Plantagenet ascended to the throne as Henry II, marking the end of the anarchy and the beginning of a powerful new dynasty, the Plantagenets. Henry II inherited a kingdom in disarray, with royal authority severely weakened, but he possessed the energy, intelligence, and ruthlessness to restore order. The anarchy, despite its destructiveness, served as a stark lesson in the importance of a clear succession and a strong central government. The memory of Christ and his saints being asleep would likely linger in the minds of future monarchs, reminding them of the perils of a weakened crown. Henry II, with his sharp legal mind and formidable presence, was precisely the king needed to rebuild the foundations of English governance and extend royal power far beyond what it had been before the chaos. The stage was set for a new era of reform and expansion. With the tumultuous period of the anarchy finally drawing to a close and a collective sigh of relief echoing across a battered England, Henry II ascended the throne in 1154, a monarch unlike any before him. Imagine a man of restless energy, sharp intellect, and a famously terrible temper, constantly on the move, overseeing a vast dominion that stretched far beyond England's shores. He wasn't just King of England. Through inheritance and marriage, he was also Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou and Maine, and Lord of Brittany. This vast territory, stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, was known as the Angevin Empire, named after his family's ancestral home of Anjou. It was an empire whose heart lay in France, a fascinating twist for a King of England, and it meant that Henry spent a considerable amount of time away from England, managing his continental possessions. This was a king who preferred the saddle to the throne, constantly traveling, constantly working, a true medieval workaholic. Henry II's primary task upon taking the throne was to restore order to a kingdom ravaged by nearly 2 decades of civil war. He immediately set about dismantling the adulterine castles, the illegal fortifications built by barons during the anarchy, and reasserting royal authority over the unruly nobility. He reinstated royal sheriffs, reformed the currency, and generally brought a strong, centralized hand back to governance. But his most enduring legacy, the one that truly shaped the future of English law, lay in his ambitious legal reforms. Prior to Henry II, justice in England was a hodgepodge of local customs, feudal courts, and church courts, often inconsistent and biased. If you were a peasant, your justice probably depended on the whim of your local lord. Henry, with his keen legal mind, sought to create a more unified and royal system of justice that would be accessible to all free men and strengthen the power of the crown. He began to send out royal judges, known as justices in eyre, on regular circuits throughout the country, bringing royal justice directly to the people. This was a revolutionary concept, bypassing local lords and establishing a direct connection between the individual and the king's law. Imagine the surprise of a local baron used to ruling his domain with absolute authority, suddenly having a royal judge appear, demanding accountability. It was a subtle but effective way of chipping away at feudal independence. One of his most significant innovations was the increased use of the jury system. While juries had existed in various forms before, Henry greatly expanded their role, particularly in land disputes, instead of relying solely on trial by combat or ordeal, which, let's be honest, probably just meant the strongest or luckiest person won. Henry introduced the concept of the grand assize, allowing a group of local sworn men to determine rightful ownership of land. Later, the use of juries would expand to criminal cases, with a presenting jury, similar to a grand jury, accusing individuals, and a trial jury determining guilt or innocence. This move towards trial by one's peers was a fundamental step towards modern legal systems, a far cry from the rather arbitrary methods that came before. So, you're saying a group of my neighbors, who probably know me, get to decide if I stole that pig. Sounds democratic for the time. However, Henry's most famous and ultimately tragic conflict arose from his desire to assert royal authority over the church. The church in medieval England was a powerful, independent institution with its own courts and laws, canon law, and its own jurisdiction over clergy. This meant that clergy accused of crimes were tried in church courts, where punishments were often much lighter than in royal courts, sometimes leading to what was known as benefit of clergy, allowing criminals to escape harsher secular sentences. Henry found this unacceptable, believing that all subjects, including clergy, should be subject to royal justice. His clash with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is one of the great dramas of medieval history. Becket had been Henry's close friend and chancellor, a loyal royal servant who enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. Henry, believing Becket would support his reforms, appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. He likely expected Becket to be a royal puppet, a man who would rubber stamp his policies. However, once elevated to his spiritual office, Becket underwent a profound transformation, becoming a fervent defender of church independence, often adopting a rigorous ascetic lifestyle. He refused to agree to Henry's Constitutions of Clarendon, 1164, a document that sought to define and limit the church's judicial powers and bring clergy under royal jurisdiction. The conflict escalated, becoming intensely personal and public. Becket fled into exile in France for several years, constantly appealing to the Pope and undermining Henry's authority. Tensions reached a boiling point in 1170. After a partial reconciliation, Henry famously uttered a frustrated cry, often quoted as, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" or something to that effect. While probably not a direct order for murder, 4 of Henry's knights took these words literally. They travelled to Canterbury and on December 29th, 1170, brutally murdered Thomas Becket within his own cathedral, a horrific act that sent shockwaves across Christian Europe. Imagine the scene: a sacred space stained with the blood of an archbishop, a man who had once been the king's closest friend. Becket was immediately revered as a martyr, and his tomb at Canterbury Cathedral became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Europe, bringing immense wealth and prestige to the cathedral. Henry II was publicly humiliated and forced to do penance, even walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allowing himself to be scourged by monks at Becket's tomb. While he was forced to drop some of his more radical reforms regarding the church, he did ultimately gain a greater degree of control over the appointment of bishops and limited appeals to Rome, showing that even in defeat, he still achieved some of his aims. Despite the Becket debacle, Henry II's legal reforms were incredibly influential and long-lasting. He is often credited with laying the foundations of English common law, a system based on judicial precedent and custom rather than strict legislative codes. His assizes, particularly the Assize of Clarendon, standardized judicial procedures and increased the reach of royal justice throughout the land. This meant that, over time, a consistent body of law emerged, binding everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful baron. It was a system that, for all its medieval quirks, was a significant step towards a more equitable and unified system of justice, a process that would continue to evolve for centuries, shaping the legal landscape we recognize today. Henry's restless energy, though sometimes destructive, ultimately reshaped the very fabric of English governance, setting the stage for future monarchs to build upon his formidable legacy. The restless energy and formidable intellect of Henry II, remember him, the king who inadvertently got his archbishop murdered, left an indelible mark on England's legal system. But his final years were consumed by a different kind of turmoil, the relentless ambition of his own sons. Imagine the grandest, most dysfunctional family reunion you can conceive. But instead of passive-aggressive comments, there are armed rebellions and vast armies. Henry had 4 legitimate sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. Each of them, often spurred on by their formidable mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman whose own life story is a saga in itself, a queen of both France and England, constantly plotted and rebelled against their father, eager to seize control of their inheritances. It was a perpetual power struggle, a true family feud that spanned continents. When Henry II finally died in 1189, exhausted and betrayed by his favorite son John, it was his third son, Richard, who ascended to the throne as Richard the Fuzz, forever known to history as Richard the Lionheart. Picture him, tall, golden-haired, charismatic, a fearsome warrior and a renowned knight, embodying the very ideals of chivalry that was so popular in the medieval imagination. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant military commander, but perhaps less interested in the day-to-day administration of England itself. He considered England more as a source of revenue and manpower for his grander ambitions. Primarily, one burning passion that consumed much of his reign: the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of religious wars sanctioned by the Latin Church in the medieval period, primarily aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim control. By the late 12th century, the Frankish Crusader states in the Levant were under severe pressure from the formidable Muslim leader Saladin. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187, after decades in Christian hands, sent shockwaves throughout Europe and spurred calls for a third crusade. Richard, a devout Christian and a warrior by nature, answered this call with an almost obsessive zeal. "To the Holy Land" would have been his constant mantra, perhaps even whispered in his sleep. Richard immediately set about raising enormous sums of money to fund his expedition. This involved selling off royal lands, offices, and even the right to self-govern for some towns. He released the King of Scotland from feudal overlordship for a hefty sum, and imposed heavy taxes on his English subjects, including a special Saladin tithe. It was a massive undertaking, a logistical nightmare, and one that certainly emptied the royal coffers, much to the chagrin of his English administrators. You could say he was the medieval equivalent of someone selling off all their furniture to buy a really fancy sports car. Richard left England in 1190, destined to be absent for almost the entirety of his 10-year reign. He journeyed to the Holy Land as part of a grand alliance with the French king Philip II Augustus and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. However, Frederick drowned en route, and Philip, after some initial cooperation, famously abandoned the crusade and returned to France, often working against Richard's interests. This left Richard as the undisputed leader of the Third Crusade, and he proved his military genius repeatedly. He achieved significant victories, notably the capture of Acre and the decisive Battle of Arsuf in 1191, where his forces inflicted a heavy defeat on Saladin's army. Richard was an expert tactician and a fearsome presence on the battlefield, leading from the front. Imagine the sight of him, lion-hearted indeed, charging into the fray, his distinctive battle axe swinging. Despite his military successes, he was ultimately unable to recapture Jerusalem, primarily due to logistical challenges, a lack of unity among the Crusaders, and the strength of Saladin's defenses. However, he did negotiate a treaty with Saladin that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, a pragmatic achievement that saved many lives and allowed a semblance of peace to return to the region. Historians still argue whether Richard could have captured Jerusalem if he had pressed his advantage, or if it was an unrealistic goal from the start. While Richard was off fighting in the Holy Land, England was governed by a series of regents, most notably William Longchamp, the Bishop of Ely and Chancellor, and later his youngest brother John. John, remember him? The Lackland, who betrayed his father, proved himself to be a rather troublesome regent, often plotting with Philip II of France against his own brother. He was constantly trying to seize more power, consolidate his own position, and generally make a nuisance of himself. It's like leaving your younger sibling in charge of your lemonade stand, only to find they've tried to open a rival business down the street. Richard's return journey from the Holy Land was fraught with peril. He was captured in Austria by Duke Leopold IV, whom he had offended during the Crusade, and then handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. Imagine the shock across Europe. The legendary Lionheart held captive. A massive ransom was demanded for his release, an astonishing £100,000 of silver, equivalent to about 2 or 3 years of England's royal income. The English people, despite his long absence and the heavy taxes he imposed, rallied to raise the ransom, demonstrating a powerful, almost mythical loyalty to their absent king. They paid through various taxes, including a tax on income and on land. Richard was finally released in 1194, returning to England to put his affairs in order and confront his scheming brother John, who had been attempting to usurp the throne with French aid. Richard, ever the pragmatist, forgave John, famously saying that John was not a man to be trusted, but a necessary evil. Richard then spent the remaining 5 years of his life largely campaigning in France, fighting Philip II to protect his Angevin territories. He was obsessed with maintaining his continental empire, a testament to the fact that for these Norman kings, England was often just one part of a much larger French-focused domain. In 1199, while besieging the castle of Chalus-Chabrol in Limousin, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound festered, and he died shortly thereafter, a rather unglamorous end for such a celebrated warrior. His death brought to the throne his infamous brother, John, whose reign would prove to be one of the most tumultuous and defining periods in English history, ultimately leading to a landmark document that would forever change the relationship between the king and his subjects, a legacy far more impactful than any crusader's exploits. The death of Richard the Lionheart, remember him, the crusading king who was more interested in the Holy Land than his own, brought his younger, much less heroic brother, John, to the English throne in 1199. Imagine a collective sigh of dread, a subtle shudder running through the kingdom. While Richard was the embodiment of chivalry, John was, well, not. He was notoriously cruel, capricious, and untrustworthy, earning him contemporary nicknames like Lackland, due to his failure to hold on to much of his inherited lands, and later, in some circles, Soft Sword for his military incompetence. His reign would become a masterclass in how not to be a popular monarch, leading to an extraordinary event that fundamentally reshaped the balance of power in England forever. John inherited a vast Angevin empire from his father and brother, stretching across France, but he proved utterly incapable of holding on to it. His primary adversary was the cunning and ambitious Philip II Augustus of France, who had long harbored desires to reclaim the English king's continental territories. John's personal failings and military blunders played directly into Philip's hands. One of John's most egregious acts was his forced marriage to Isabella of Angoulême, who was already betrothed to one of his own vassals, Hugh X of Lusignan. This provided Philip with a convenient pretext to summon John to his court in 1202 to answer for his actions. When John predictably refused to appear, Philip declared all of John's French lands forfeit. What followed was a swift and devastating military campaign by Philip II. John's forces, hampered by his poor leadership, internal disloyalty among his barons, and a distinct lack of strategic foresight, crumbled. Piece by piece, the vast Angevin territories in France fell: Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. By 1204, the heartland of the Norman conquest, Normandy itself, was lost to the French crown. This was a catastrophic blow to the English monarchy, severing the deep ties that had bound England to continental France for over a century and a half. Imagine the outrage and humiliation among the Norman barons in England, many of whom still held lands and familial connections in Normandy, now effectively cut off. The loss of Normandy was a critical turning point, forcing the English monarchy to focus its attention more squarely on England itself, inadvertently setting the stage for a more unified national identity, albeit one forged in the fires of defeat. Beyond his military incompetence, John also clashed bitterly with the Catholic Church. In 1207, he became embroiled in a dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. John wanted his own candidate, while the Pope appointed Stephen Langton, a highly respected scholar. John, in a fit of royal stubbornness, refused to accept Langton, leading Pope Innocent III to place England under an interdict in 1208. Imagine the entire country for 6 long years without church services, baptisms, marriages, or Christian burials. The bells of the churches fell silent, and the sacraments were withheld. It was a terrifying prospect for a deeply religious medieval populace, a spiritual deprivation that caused immense distress. When John remained defiant, the Pope eventually excommunicated him in 1209, effectively declaring him an outcast from the Christian community. This was a profoundly dangerous position for a medieval king, as it could legitimize rebellion and even assassination in the eyes of his subjects. John eventually capitulated in 1213, agreeing to hold England as a feudal fief of the papacy, paying an annual tribute, a deeply humiliating concession that further eroded his prestige among his barons. With his reputation in tatters, his continental lands lost, and his coffers depleted by expensive, ultimately fruitless campaigns to regain his French possessions, John found himself increasingly isolated and unpopular. His constant demands for money, often through arbitrary and oppressive taxes, further alienated his powerful barons. He abused his feudal rights, levied exorbitant fines, and generally behaved like a medieval tyrant with a penchant for petty vindictiveness. Historians still argue whether John was truly as evil as his reputation suggests, or merely an incompetent ruler surrounded by powerful enemies. Whatever the truth, his actions pushed the patience of his barons to its breaking point. Finally, in 1215, a coalition of powerful barons, led by figures like Robert Fitzwalter, rose in open rebellion against John's tyrannical rule. They marched on London, seizing the city and forcing the king to negotiate. What transpired at Runnymede, a meadow beside the River Thames, near Windsor, on June 15th, 1215, was one of the most significant moments in legal and constitutional history, the sealing of Magna Carta. Imagine the scene: a tense standoff between an unwilling king and a formidable group of armed barons, their demands clear and unyielding. Magna Carta, meaning Great Charter, was not initially intended as a document of universal rights, but rather a practical peace treaty, a list of grievances from the barons designed to protect their feudal rights and limit the king's arbitrary power. It included clauses that protected church rights, limited the king's ability to raise taxes without consultation, guaranteed certain legal rights, such as the right to a fair trial by one's peers, and established that the king was not above the law. It was a groundbreaking concept. The idea that even a monarch's power was subject to legal constraints. One of its most famous clauses states, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land." Sounds quite revolutionary, doesn't it? Especially for 1215. John, of course, had no intention of abiding by Magna Carta in the long term. As soon as the barons dispersed, he appealed to the Pope, who swiftly annulled the charter, declaring it null and void. This reignited the civil war, known as the First Barons' War. The barons, in desperation, even offered the English crown to Prince Louis of France, the future Louis VIII, who promptly invaded England. The situation was dire for John, but fate intervened. He died of dysentery in October 1216, amidst the ongoing conflict, often attributed to eating too many peaches and drinking too much cider. A rather inglorious end for a king who had brought his kingdom to the brink. John's death, however, proved to be a turning point. With a young 9-year-old son, Henry III, now on the throne, the regents who governed in his name could reissue Magna Carta, appealing to the barons' sense of loyalty and offering a fresh start. Magna Carta, in its various reissues, ultimately became a cornerstone of English law and a symbol of limited government, inspiring future movements for constitutionalism and individual rights across the world. While born out of feudal squabbles, its principles eventually resonated far beyond its initial context, proving that even a document initially signed under duress could grow into something truly foundational. The death of King John, remember him, the king who managed to lose Normandy and was forced to seal Magna Carta, brought a fragile hope of peace to England, a much-needed respite after years of his disastrous reign and the ensuing civil war. His son, Henry III, was just 9 years old when he inherited the throne in 1216. Imagine the challenges of ruling a kingdom in such turmoil with a child on the throne. It's like trying to steer a massive storm-tossed ship with a small child at the helm. Fortunately for England, a capable regency council, led by the venerable and respected knight William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, stepped in to govern in the young king's name. Marshal, known as the Greatest Knight, was instrumental in ending the First Barons' War, reassuring the rebellious barons, and most crucially, reissuing Magna Carta in a revised form. This strategic move, along with the eventual withdrawal of the French Prince Louis, helped stabilize the kingdom and allowed Henry III to eventually assume his full powers. Henry III's reign, which lasted for an astonishing 56 years, 1216 to 1272, was one of the longest in English history, but it was also marked by persistent political instability and growing discontent among his barons. Unlike his formidable grandfather, Henry II, or his warrior uncle, Richard, Henry III was less interested in military conquest and more inclined towards piety, art, and grand building projects, particularly the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. He was a devout king, almost excessively so for some, with a strong devotion to Edward the Confessor, whom he considered his patron saint. He probably spent more time consulting with architects and master masons than with his military commanders, a preference that sometimes frustrated his more pragmatic nobles. One of Henry's major shortcomings was his reliance on foreign favorites, particularly his Lusignan relatives, his mother Isabella's family from Poitou, and his wife Eleanor of Provence's Savoyard kin. These foreign connections, while perhaps understandable for a king whose family still held strong continental ties, led to an influx of foreign advisors and office holders who often displaced English barons from positions of power and influence. Imagine the resentment among the English nobility, seeing lucrative offices and royal patronage going to outsiders who sometimes didn't even speak English. It was a constant source of friction, a low hum of discontent that steadily grew louder over the decades. They probably grumbled about it endlessly over their roasted meats and watered-down wine, much like modern office workers complaining about the new manager who brings in all his old colleagues. Henry's foreign policy was another source of frustration. He harbored a lifelong ambition to reclaim his lost Angevin territories in France, especially Normandy. These expensive and largely unsuccessful campaigns, often requiring enormous sums of money levied from his English subjects, yielded little in the way of tangible results. His attempts to install his younger son, Edmund, on the throne of Sicily, a project known as the Sicilian business, was particularly costly and ultimately fruitless. This constant demand for money, combined with his perceived extravagance and his reliance on foreign favorites, pushed his barons to the brink. By the mid-13th century, baronial discontent reached a boiling point. Led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, a charismatic, ambitious, and deeply pious Anglo-Norman baron, who, ironically, was himself originally French, the barons demanded reforms that would limit the king's power and give them a greater say in governance. De Montfort was a complex figure, sometimes autocratic, sometimes genuinely progressive, but he believed strongly in the principle of consultation. In 1258, a group of powerful barons forced Henry III to accept the provisions of Oxford, a revolutionary document that effectively stripped the king of much of his power and established a baronial council to oversee royal administration. It was a bold attempt to create a form of constitutional monarchy, a direct challenge to the king's divine right to rule. Historians still argue whether de Montfort was a true reformer or merely an ambitious aristocrat seeking personal power. Perhaps he was a bit of both. Henry, predictably, chafed under these restrictions and attempted to reassert his authority, leading to a breakdown in relations and eventually open warfare, the Second Barons' War, 1264-1267. The conflict saw several key battles and dramatic shifts in power. In 1264, at the Battle of Lewes, Simon de Montfort achieved a stunning victory, capturing Henry III and his son, the future Edward I. For a brief period, de Montfort effectively ruled England in the king's name, demonstrating a remarkable degree of control. During his period of dominance, Simon de Montfort summoned a parliament in 1265 that is considered highly significant in the development of representative government. This parliament included, for the first time, not only the great lords and clergy, but also elected representatives from the shires, knights of the shire, and, crucially, from the boroughs, citizens or burgesses. This inclusion of commoners, though initially perhaps a pragmatic move to broaden support, laid an important precedent for future parliaments and the concept of no taxation without representation. It's one of those moments where an immediate necessity evolves into a long-lasting principle. However, de Montfort's rule became increasingly autocratic, alienating some of his baronial allies. Henry III's eldest son, Prince Edward, a remarkably able and ambitious young man, eventually escaped captivity and rallied the royalist forces. In 1265, at the Battle of Evesham, Edward decisively defeated de Montfort's army. Simon de Montfort himself was killed in the battle, his body brutally mutilated by his vengeful enemies, a testament to the bitter animosity of the conflict. It was a gruesome end for a man who had dared to challenge royal power so directly. With de Montfort dead, royal authority was eventually restored, though it took a couple of more years to fully quell all resistance. While Henry III formally regained his power, the Second Barons' War and the radical ideas put forth by de Montfort had a lasting impact. The idea that the king's power was not absolute, that he should consult with his leading subjects, and that even commoners might have a voice in governance, had taken root. The practice of summoning parliaments, though initially irregular and primarily for raising taxes, became more common and evolved into a crucial institution for both kings and subjects. The stage was now set for the next monarch, Henry III's son, the ambitious and formidable Edward I, to take these nascent ideas of governance and, ironically, use them to further consolidate royal power and embark on grand new conquests that would truly shape the map of Britain. After the long and often turbulent reign of his devout but politically inept father, Henry III, the throne passed in 1272 to Edward VI, king, whose very presence seemed to embody strength, purpose, and a rather imposing height, earning him the nickname Longshanks. Imagine him, a tall, stern figure with a piercing gaze who had learned valuable lessons from his father's struggles and the chaos of the Barons' Wars. Edward was a pragmatist and a formidable military commander, determined to restore strong royal authority, and crucially, to unite all of Great Britain under a single English crown. If his father was a builder of abbeys, Edward was a builder of castles and a conqueror of nations, forging the very identity of a unified Britain through both law and often brutal force. Edward IX immediately set about consolidating royal power, building upon the foundations laid by Henry II's legal reforms. He understood the importance of a strong and centralized legal system, and he continued the work of standardizing laws and procedures. He passed numerous statutes, important pieces of legislation that clarified land tenure, reformed the legal profession, and addressed various aspects of society, from trade to crime. These statutes were often developed and enacted through Parliament, which, under Edward, began to evolve into a more regular and significant institution. While still primarily a tool for the king to raise taxes and gain consent for his policies, Edward's frequent summoning of representatives from the shires and boroughs, remember those, gave it a growing sense of legitimacy and importance. He famously stated that what touches all should be approved by all, a seemingly democratic sentiment for a medieval king, even if his primary motivation was to ensure financial and political support for his ambitious foreign policies. But Edward's true ambition, the one that would consume much of his reign and define his legacy, was the conquest of Wales. For centuries, Wales had maintained a fiercely independent spirit, a land of proud Celtic princes who constantly resisted English encroachment. While the English kings had long claimed suzerainty over Wales, the Welsh princes had largely retained effective control over their territories, often raiding the English borders and posing a constant threat. Edward saw this fragmented political landscape as an unacceptable affront to his vision of a unified Britain. He was not one to tolerate half measures. His first major campaign against Wales began in 1277, targeting Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, the last independent Prince of Wales. Llywelyn, who styled himself Prince of Wales, had refused to do homage to Edward and had expanded his influence in recent years. Edward launched a massive, well-organized invasion, employing a sophisticated strategy that combined naval support, fortified supply lines, and overwhelming military force. His army built a series of strategically placed castles, often imposing stone fortresses like Flint and Rhuddlan, which acted as bases for his operations and symbols of English dominance. Imagine the sheer scale of the logistical undertaking, moving thousands of men and supplies across difficult terrain. By 1277, Llywelyn was forced to submit, signing the humiliating Treaty of Aberconwy, which severely curtailed his power and reduced his territory to just the mountainous region of Gwynedd. It seemed Edward had achieved his goal with relative ease. However, Welsh resentment festered, and in 1282, Llywelyn's brother, Dafydd ap Gruffudd, launched a desperate, widespread rebellion. Llywelyn was reluctantly drawn into it. This time, Edward's response was even more brutal and decisive. He committed his full military might to crushing the Welsh resistance. The war was prolonged and difficult, fought in the rugged terrain of Snowdonia, but the English had superior numbers, resources, and engineering capabilities. In December 1282, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd was killed in a skirmish near Builth Wells, a moment that effectively marked the end of independent Wales. His brother Dafydd was captured and brutally executed as a traitor in 1283. With the Welsh princely line extinguished, Edward declared Wales annexed to the English crown. To solidify his conquest, he embarked on an ambitious and incredibly expensive castle-building program, constructing a ring of magnificent, impregnable fortresses across North Wales, including Beaumaris, Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech. These were not just castles. They were architectural marvels of military engineering, designed to overawe and control the conquered population. One might wonder if the Welsh looked at these imposing stone giants and thought, well, at least they're pretty. To further cement English rule and appease the Welsh, Edward's son, the future Edward II, was born in Caernarfon Castle in 1284. In 1301, he was invested as the first Prince of Wales, a title that has been traditionally held by the heir apparent to the English and later British throne ever since. This was a clever piece of political theatre, designed to integrate Wales into the English system while giving the impression of respecting Welsh identity. The conquest of Wales under Edward the Fern was total and permanent. English law and administration were imposed, though some Welsh customs were allowed to persist. The Welsh marcher lords, who had long held semi-independent territories along the border, found their power curtailed by the assertive royal authority. Edward the Fern's campaigns in Wales also honed the English military, developing tactics and logistics that would prove crucial in future conflicts. He had achieved his aim. Wales was now definitively part of the English realm, no longer a collection of independent princedoms, but a subordinate territory under the English crown. However, this success in Wales would merely whet his appetite for further conquest, turning his gaze northwards towards an even more formidable and enduring challenge, Scotland. Having successfully subdued Wales and integrated it into the English realm, Edward I, remember him, the Hammer of the Scots, now turned his formidable attention northward towards the fiercely independent Kingdom of Scotland. Imagine him, standing on a windswept hill, gazing towards the misty Scottish borders, his ambition seemingly boundless. Unlike Wales, Scotland was a long-established kingdom, with its own monarchy, laws, and distinct cultural identity. It wasn't merely a collection of unruly principalities. It was a sovereign nation. Edward's involvement in Scottish affairs began not with outright invasion, but with an invitation, a seemingly benevolent intervention that would quickly turn into a brutal campaign of conquest. It's a classic tale of a powerful neighbor offering help that quickly morphs into domination. The opportunity arose in 1286, when King Alexander III of Scotland died without a direct heir, leaving his young granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as the only claimant. When Margaret also died in 1290 en route to Scotland, a major succession crisis erupted. 13 different claimants, known as the competitors, put forward their cases for the Scottish throne. The Scottish nobility, seeking to avoid civil war, invited Edward III to arbitrate their dispute, hoping he would act as an impartial judge. This was a fateful decision, one that some historians still argue was a profound misjudgment on Scotland's part, underestimating Edward's true intentions. Edward, ever the opportunist, seized this chance to assert his own long-held claim of overlordship over Scotland, a claim largely based on shaky historical precedents and Norman-era feudal theory. He declared himself Lord Paramount of Scotland, and in 1292 awarded the Scottish crown to John Balliol, a relatively weak claimant whom he believed he could easily control. Balliol, now King of Scotland, was forced to acknowledge Edward as his feudal overlord, humiliatingly swearing homage to the English king. Imagine the Scottish nobles, seething with resentment, watching their new king kneel before their powerful southern neighbor. However, John Balliol, despite his initial submission, chafed under Edward's constant interference and increasingly heavy-handed demands, which included providing military service for Edward's wars in France. In 1295, Balliol, encouraged by his nobles, openly defied Edward and formed an alliance with France, known as the Auld Alliance, which would endure for centuries. This act of defiance infuriated Edward. Edward's response was swift and brutal. In 1296, he launched a full-scale invasion of Scotland, beginning with the sacking of Berwick-upon-Tweed, a prosperous Scottish border town, where he massacred thousands of its inhabitants. He then swept through Scotland, defeating the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar, forcing John Balliol to abdicate and stripping him of his royal insignia. Edward then removed the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, from Scone Abbey and brought it to Westminster Abbey, a powerful symbolic act designed to assert English dominance and dismantle Scottish nationhood. He also appointed English administrators to govern Scotland, effectively treating it as a conquered province. Edward famously declared, "He has done good business who has brought a good beast to sell," a rather dismissive comment about his new acquisition. But the spirit of Scottish independence was far from broken. In 1297, a charismatic and courageous commoner, William Wallace, rose to lead a widespread popular rebellion. Imagine the audacity of a simple knight with no great noble lineage rallying the Scottish people against the mighty English king. Wallace achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297, where his forces, using the terrain to their advantage, trapped and decimated a larger English army. This victory briefly liberated much of Scotland and saw Wallace proclaimed Guardian of Scotland. It was a moment of immense national pride, a real underdog story. Edward, however, was not a king to accept defeat. He returned to Scotland with a massive, well-trained army, confronting Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. This time, Edward's superior military tactics, particularly his use of longbowmen, proved decisive. The Scottish schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen, were vulnerable to English arrows, and the Scottish forces were routed. Wallace managed to escape, but his military power was broken. He became a hunted fugitive for several years, eventually betrayed, captured, and taken to London in 1305. There, he was brutally executed as a traitor, drawn and quartered, a gruesome warning to any who dared defy the English crown. His execution, rather than suppressing the Scottish spirit, only solidified him as a martyr and national hero. Just when Edward thought he had finally crushed Scottish resistance, another, even more formidable leader emerged, Robert the Bruce. A Scottish nobleman with a strong claim to the throne, Bruce had previously sworn fealty to Edward, but after Wallace's death, he decided to fight for Scottish independence. In 1306, Bruce dramatically killed his rival, John Comyn, and was crowned King of Scots at Scone. This act of defiance reignited the war. Edward, now an old man and ailing, launched one last campaign to crush Bruce, but he died on the way to Scotland in 1307, his final breath likely filled with a desperate desire to see Scotland subdued. His dying wish was that his bones be carried at the head of his army until Scotland was fully conquered. His failure to utterly conquer Scotland remained an unfinished ambition, a testament to the resilience of the Scottish people and the formidable leadership of Robert the Bruce, who would continue the fight against Edward's less capable successor, securing Scotland's independence in a legendary battle that would resonate through the ages. With the formidable Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, finally dead on his way to crush Robert the Bruce, the heavy mantle of the English crown fell upon his son, Edward II, in 1307. Imagine the hopes and expectations resting on his shoulders. His father had been a king of immense capability, even if ruthless. But Edward II, unfortunately for England, possessed none of his father's strategic genius, military prowess, or iron will. Instead, he was famously described as being more interested in farming, swimming, and manual crafts than in the art of governance or warfare. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing for a person, but it was disastrous for a king in an age of constant conflict and powerful, ambitious barons. His reign would become a tragic tale of royal weakness, personal scandal, and ultimately, a brutal and humiliating downfall. It's almost like a medieval soap opera, but with real crowns and very sharp knives. Edward II's greatest failing was his constant reliance on a series of unpopular male favorites whom he showered with lavish gifts, titles, and political power, often at the expense of the established nobility. The first and most infamous of these was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight described as arrogant, flamboyant, and disrespectful of the English barons. Gaveston's meteoric rise, his open contempt for the magnates, and his undue influence over the king infuriated the powerful English aristocracy. They felt sidelined, insulted, and robbed of their traditional role in governance. Imagine the simmering rage in the great halls of England as this upstart Gaveston, with his flashy clothes and disdainful remarks, essentially ran the kingdom, while the king seemed more concerned with trivialities. The barons, remembering the lessons of Magna Carta and the Barons' Wars, were not about to tolerate such a blatant disregard for their rights and authority. The baronial opposition, led by powerful figures like Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, Edward's cousin no less, repeatedly demanded Gaveston's exile. Edward, hopelessly devoted to his favorite, resisted fiercely, leading to a prolonged power struggle. This was not a quick, decisive conflict, but a drawn-out political crisis, punctuated by short periods of Gaveston's exile and subsequent recall. Finally, in 1312, Gaveston was captured by the barons, and despite promises of a trial, was summarily executed. Imagine the shock and outrage, even among some of the barons, at this extra-legal killing of a royal favourite. It was a clear demonstration that the barons were willing to go to extreme lengths to assert their will, and that the king's authority was dangerously fragile. Gaveston's death, however, did not solve Edward II's problems. It merely exposed his vulnerability and cleared the way for a new, equally unpopular favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, and his father. The Despensers were even more ambitious and rapacious than Gaveston, accumulating vast wealth and power, and pushing the king into increasingly authoritarian policies. This led to renewed baronial opposition, including a major uprising in 1321-1322, known as the Despenser War, led once again by Thomas of Lancaster. This time, Edward II, perhaps spurred by the memory of Gaveston, rallied enough support to defeat the rebellious barons. Thomas of Lancaster was captured and executed, a brutal reprisal that temporarily strengthened Edward's hand, but only intensified the underlying resentments. While these internal struggles consumed Edward's attention, the kingdom faced a major external threat from Scotland, where Robert the Bruce, remember him, was consolidating his power and systematically reclaiming lost territories. Edward I had left a dying command to his son to complete the conquest, but Edward II proved disastrously incompetent as a military leader. His one major attempt to crush the Scottish rebellion culminated in the catastrophic Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Imagine the scene at Bannockburn: a vast English army, numerically superior and confident, facing a smaller but highly disciplined Scottish force under Robert the Bruce. Edward II, rather than utilizing his cavalry effectively, allowed them to get bogged down in marshy ground, and his strategic blunders led to a devastating defeat. The Scottish pikemen, or schiltrons, proved impenetrable to the English knights, and the English army was routed, suffering immense casualties. It was a crushing, humiliating defeat for England, one of the worst in its history, and it permanently secured Scotland's independence. Robert the Bruce's victory was total, cementing his place as Scotland's national hero and effectively ending English claims of overlordship for centuries to come. For Edward II, it was a profound blow to his prestige and authority, exposing his military ineptitude to all of Europe. Well, that didn't go as planned. Would be an understatement, wouldn't it? The latter years of Edward II's reign were marked by increasing tyranny, driven by the Despensers, and widespread famine caused by the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which devastated much of Europe. His queen, Isabella of France, initially tried to mediate between her husband and the barons, but she grew increasingly alienated by Edward's devotion to the Despensers and her own declining influence. She was a powerful and intelligent woman, a she-wolf of France, as she would later be called, and she would not suffer perceived slights indefinitely. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France on a diplomatic mission, ostensibly to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. While there, she famously took her young son, Prince Edward, the future Edward III, with her, refusing to return to England as long as the Despensers remained in power. In France, she openly began an affair with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had previously been exiled by Edward II. Together, Isabella and Mortimer raised an invasion force and landed in England in 1326. The invasion was met with widespread support. Edward II's few remaining supporters quickly abandoned him, and the Despensers were captured and brutally executed. Edward himself fled, but was eventually captured and imprisoned. In a move unprecedented in English history, he was formally deposed by Parliament in January 1327. largely on grounds of incompetence and unfitness to rule. His young son was proclaimed King Edward III. Edward II was then transferred to Berkeley Castle, where, in September 1327, he was famously and brutally murdered, likely on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer, through a red-hot poker inserted into his anus to leave no outward marks. It was a horrific and ignominious end for a king who had failed so spectacularly to command the respect or loyalty of his realm, serving as a chilling reminder of the perils of royal weakness in a brutal medieval world. With the brutal and ignominious deposition and murder of Edward II, remember him, the king who couldn't quite get a handle on either his favorites or the Scots. The stage was set for his young son, Edward III, to ascend the throne in 1327. Imagine the weight on the shoulders of a 14-year-old boy coming to power amidst the scandalous backdrop of his father's demise and the powerful regency of his mother, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. For the first 3 years of his reign, Edward was largely a puppet king, overshadowed by his domineering mother and her ambitious paramour. Mortimer, in particular, exercised tyrannical power, alienating many of the English nobility who resented his rapaciousness and the shame he brought upon the royal family. But Edward III was no weakling like his father. He was a young man of remarkable intelligence, charisma, and a fierce determination to restore royal authority and reassert England's prestige on the international stage. In 1330, at the age of 17, he staged a dramatic coup. With the help of loyal nobles, he surprised Mortimer and Isabella at Nottingham Castle, capturing Mortimer, who was swiftly tried and executed for treason. Isabella was forced into retirement, living out her days in comfortable, though controlled, seclusion. This decisive act immediately established Edward III as a king in his own right, a strong and capable ruler who would not tolerate being manipulated. It was a clear signal to everyone. The boy king was now a man, and he meant business. Edward III's reign, which lasted from 1327 to 1377, proved to be one of the most glorious and transformative periods in medieval English history, largely defined by the beginning of the 100 Years' War. This monumental conflict, a series of intermittent wars fought between England and France, would rage for over a century, profoundly shaping the destinies of both nations. The roots of the conflict were deep and complex, entangled with centuries of Anglo-French relations, particularly the legacy of the Norman conquest and the English king's extensive landholdings in France, which, though diminished since John's reign, still included Gascony, Aquitaine. The immediate trigger for the war was a succession crisis in France. When the French King Charles IV, the last of the direct Capetian line, died without a male heir in 1328, Edward III, as his nephew, through his mother Isabella, Charles IV's sister, laid claim to the French throne. However, the French nobility, invoking Salic law, which forbade female succession or succession through a female line, instead chose Philip VI, a cousin, as their new king, establishing the House of Valois. Edward initially grudgingly accepted Philip VI's ascension and even paid homage for his French lands, but the underlying tensions simmered. Imagine the diplomatic dances, the elaborate courtesies masking deep-seated ambitions and rivalries. The final spark ignited in 1337, when Philip VI confiscated Edward's Duchy of Aquitaine, citing Edward's sheltering of a rebel French noble. Edward, now feeling both insulted and strategically threatened, formally reasserted his claim to the French throne and launched an invasion, effectively commencing the 100 Years' War. This was no minor skirmish. It was a grand, audacious gamble by the English king, a bid for nothing less than the crown of France. Edward III proved to be a brilliant military strategist and tactician, leading his armies with skill and inspiring loyalty. He understood the changing nature of medieval warfare, recognizing the power of the English longbow, a weapon that would become synonymous with English military prowess. The longbow, capable of firing arrows with incredible force and rapidity, could devastate formations of heavily armored knights. It was a game changer, leveling the playing field against numerically superior French forces, a bit like a medieval sniper rifle against a tank. The early phase of the 100 Years' War was marked by a series of spectacular English victories that shocked Europe. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was a watershed moment. Edward, with his son Edward, the Black Prince, a formidable warrior in his own right, whose name sounds like it belongs in a fantasy novel, skillfully positioned his army on a ridge, forcing the French to attack uphill. The English longbowmen unleashed volleys of arrows that decimated the French cavalry and Genoese crossbowmen. It was a decisive and humiliating defeat for the French, a testament to English tactical superiority and the devastating power of the longbow. Imagine the chaos, the screams, the arrows falling like deadly rain. Following Crécy, Edward III besieged and captured the strategic port of Calais in 1347, which would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries, providing a vital bridgehead into France. Just a few years later, in 1356, the Black Prince achieved another stunning victory at the Battle of Poitiers. Here, he captured the French King John II himself, leading to a massive ransom demand and further humiliation for France. These victories brought immense prestige and wealth to England and solidified Edward III's reputation as one of Europe's greatest military commanders. Domestically, the war fostered a growing sense of English national identity. The shared struggle against France, the common language, Middle English, was increasingly becoming the language of all classes, though French remained in official use. And the pride in military victories began to unite the English people across social strata. Parliament, continuously summoned to grant funds for the war, gained increased influence and power, with the House of Commons, representing knights and burgesses, emerging as a distinct and important body, often bargaining for concessions in exchange for financial support. Historians still argue whether the 100 Years' War truly forged a distinct English identity, or merely accelerated existing trends. However, the war also came at a tremendous cost. It was incredibly expensive, requiring enormous taxes and loans, and it caused immense suffering in France, where the fighting largely took place. But just as England seemed poised for even greater triumphs, an unforeseen and far more devastating enemy arrived on its shores, one that paid no heed to national borders or royal claims, and would leave a mark far more profound than any battle. Just as the triumphs of Crécy and Poitiers had filled England with a swaggering sense of military invincibility, and the war with France was consolidating a nascent national identity, an unseen, terrifying enemy began to creep across Europe, oblivious to borders, armies, or royal ambitions. Imagine, if you will, the bustling streets of London, the crowded markets, the vibrant ports, suddenly silenced, replaced by an eerie quiet, punctuated only by the tolling of death bells. In the summer of 1348, this invisible horror, the Black Death, arrived on English shores, likely carried by fleas on rats, aboard merchant ships docking in the southern ports, and it would irrevocably transform the very fabric of medieval society. This wasn't just another localized epidemic. This was a pandemic of unprecedented scale and ferocity, a virulent strain of bubonic plague that swept through the population with terrifying speed and lethality. Its symptoms were horrific, painful swellings known as buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck, followed by fevers, vomiting, and delirium, with death often coming within days. People would go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. The sheer speed and indiscriminacy of the disease, striking down rich and poor, noble and peasant alike, led to widespread panic, despair, and a profound sense of apocalyptic dread. Many believed it was divine punishment, a scourge sent by God for humanity's sins. Imagine the desperate prayers, the frantic efforts to understand what was happening, all against the backdrop of unimaginable suffering. The Black Death raged through England in waves from 1348 to 1351, and subsequent, less severe outbreaks would recur for decades afterward. While precise mortality figures are debated by historians, it's generally estimated that somewhere between 30% and 50% of England's population perished in the initial outbreak alone, possibly even higher in some densely populated areas. That means perhaps 1 in every 2 or 3 people you knew suddenly vanished. Think of the sheer scale of that loss, the millions of lives extinguished, the families shattered, the villages emptied, and the fields left untended. It was a demographic catastrophe of epic proportions, dwarfing any casualties from war. The immediate social consequences were devastating. Society descended into a grim, desperate struggle for survival. Mass burials became common, as the sheer number of dead overwhelmed traditional burial practices. Fear and suspicion ran rampant, sometimes leading to scapegoating, though less so in England than in some parts of continental Europe. The traditional social order, which had been in place for centuries under the feudal system, was profoundly shaken. With so many laborers dead, there was a severe labor shortage. Suddenly, the surviving peasants, who had for so long been tied to the land and subject to their lord's whims, found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. Imagine, for centuries, peasant labor was cheap and plentiful. Now a lord might have vast fields, but no one to work them. Wages for agricultural laborers and skilled artisans skyrocketed, sometimes doubling or tripling. Peasants began to demand better terms, greater freedom, and higher pay, threatening to leave their manors for lords who would offer better conditions. This newfound leverage was revolutionary. It was a bit like a sudden, unexpected market correction. But for human labor, the ruling classes, naturally, viewed this with alarm and tried to resist these economic shifts. In 1349, Edward III, despite being consumed by the war in France, issued the Ordinance of Laborers, and later, the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and compel laborers to work for their traditional lords. These laws were largely ineffective, difficult to enforce, and only served to fuel resentment among the common people, who felt that the lords were trying to deny them the benefits of their newfound economic leverage. It was like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. The changes were simply too fundamental. The long-term economic effects of the Black Death were profound. The labor shortage led to a shift away from labor-intensive arable farming towards less labor-intensive sheep farming, contributing to the growth of the wool trade, which would become a cornerstone of the English economy. Many manors experienced a decline in rents and services, forcing lords to commute feudal obligations for money payments, further eroding the old feudal system. Peasants gained more freedom of movement and greater economic independence, accelerating the decline of serfdom in England. It was a slow but inexorable shift in power, a quiet revolution born out of unimaginable tragedy, culturally and psychologically. The Black Death left an enduring mark. It prompted intense introspection, religious fervor, and sometimes a questioning of traditional authority. Art and literature of the period became more preoccupied with themes of death, mortality, and the fleeting nature of life, reflected in works like the Danse Macabre, Dance of Death. The Church, despite its efforts, often struggled to provide comfort or explanation for the plague, leading some to question its authority and the efficacy of its prayers. Monasteries, with their communal living, were particularly hard hit, suffering massive losses, which further weakened their intellectual and spiritual influence. Paradoxically, despite the devastation, the post-plague world also saw new opportunities. The increased wealth of surviving peasants led to a greater demand for consumer goods, stimulating trade and craft industries. Education, though initially disrupted, also saw a shift as new colleges and universities were founded to train clergy and administrators, filling the gaps left by the plague's victims. The English language, remember that it was still evolving, gained further ground as Latin and French, the languages of the dwindling educated elite, became less dominant outside of specific circles. The Black Death was a cataclysm that fundamentally reshaped English society, economy, and culture. It accelerated the decline of feudalism, empowered the common people, and contributed to the rise of a more market-driven economy. While Edward III continued to pursue the 100 Years' War with renewed vigor, ultimately achieving another great triumph, the underlying social changes wrought by the plague would soon manifest in a different kind of conflict, a massive uprising from within the heart of England itself, one that would truly challenge the established order. The immense devastation wrought by the Black Death, remember that terrifying plague that emptied villages and transformed society, continued to ripple through England, creating profound social and economic shifts. While the Black Prince was still winning dazzling victories in France, the seeds of discontent were growing fiercely back home. The surviving peasantry, emboldened by their newfound bargaining power due to the labor shortage, chafed under the continued attempts by the landowning class to reimpose old feudal obligations and restrict wages through laws like the Statute of Laborers. Imagine a vast social pressure cooker slowly building steam, with the lid held down by increasingly desperate aristocrats. The common folk, for the first time in generations, felt a real sense of their own worth and power, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. When the glorious but incredibly costly reign of Edward III finally ended in 1377, the crown passed not to his renowned son, the Black Prince, who had died in 1376, but to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II. Imagine a young, inexperienced king inheriting a kingdom still reeling from plague, exhausted by decades of war and simmering with social unrest. Richard's minority meant that England was once again ruled by a regency council, dominated by his uncles, particularly John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, a powerful and often unpopular figure. Gaunt was seen by many as grasping and arrogant, and his vast wealth and influence made him a target for public resentment. It's almost like a medieval version of a trust fund baby, but with an army and immense political power. The financial demands of the ongoing 100 Years' War, which had largely turned against England after Edward III's peak, proved to be the final straw. The English government, desperately short of funds, resorted to a highly unpopular and deeply resented form of taxation, The poll tax. Unlike traditional taxes based on property or income, the poll tax was levied as a flat rate on every adult in the kingdom, regardless of their wealth. This meant the poorest peasant paid the same as the wealthiest baron. Imagine the outrage. So I, who barely have enough to eat, have to pay the same as the lord who owns half the county. This is madness. The tax was introduced in 1377, repeated in 1379, and then again, with an even higher rate, in 1380. The repeated imposition of this regressive tax, coupled with corrupt collection methods, ignited the explosive discontent that had been brewing for decades. In May 1381, the pressure cooker finally blew its top. Sparked by resistance to poll tax collection in Essex and Kent, the peasants' revolt erupted with astonishing speed and ferocity. This wasn't just a local disturbance. It was a widespread, coordinated uprising involving tens of thousands of common people from across southeastern England. Imagine armed villagers, peasants, and disgruntled artisans, fueled by economic grievance, a sense of injustice, and perhaps a dash of revolutionary fervor, marching towards London. Their leaders were charismatic figures like Wat Tyler, a charismatic speaker, and a radical preacher named John Ball, who famously asked, "When Adam delved and Eve spawned, who then was the gentleman?" A powerful indictment of the feudal hierarchy. This simple rhyme became the rallying cry for social equality and the abolition of serfdom. The rebels marched on London, destroying property, burning manor records, especially debt bonds and labor records, attacking hated tax collectors, and even storming the Tower of London. They captured and executed several high-ranking officials, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and the Lord High Treasurer, Robert Hales, both of whom were seen as architects of the poll tax and symbols of corrupt government. It was a terrifying moment for the ruling elite, a complete breakdown of law and order. Richard II, then just 14 years old, displayed astonishing bravery and composure during this crisis, while his advisors and older relatives, including John of Gaunt, who was away at the time, panicked and sought refuge. Richard rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End and then later at Smithfield. Imagine the scene: a teenage king facing down an angry armed mob, unarmed himself, relying only on his royal authority and his wits. At Mile End, Richard promised to abolish serfdom and grant other concessions, temporarily placating some of the rebels. However, at Smithfield, negotiations broke down, and Wat Tyler, the charismatic rebel leader, was inexplicably killed by William Walworth, the mayor of London, or one of the king's squires. The death of Wat Tyler could have plunged the situation into even greater chaos. But young Richard, with remarkable presence of mind, rode forward, proclaiming to the stunned rebels, "I am your captain, follow me." He then promised to grant their demands and lead them himself. This bold move, combined with the loss of their leader and the arrival of loyal troops, caused the rebellion to dissipate. The immediate crisis was averted, but the king's promises, once the immediate threat was gone, were, predictably, largely reneged upon. Richard famously declared that villains you are, and villains you shall remain, firmly reasserting royal and feudal authority. The ringleaders of the revolt were hunted down and brutally executed across the country, serving as a harsh lesson against challenging the established order. Despite its suppression, the peasants' revolt had a profound and lasting impact. It demonstrated the fragility of royal authority and the potential for widespread popular unrest. While the immediate demands for the abolition of serfdom were not met, the long-term trends accelerated by the Black Death continued. The nobility, perhaps chastened by the revolt, became more reluctant to impose such direct, oppressive taxes, and serfdom continued its slow decline in England, eventually fading away over the next century as labor services were commuted to money rents. The revolt also provided a powerful, if terrifying, precedent for future popular movements, showing that the common people, when pushed too far, had the capacity to rise up and demand change. Richard II, having shown flashes of bravery and political acumen during the revolt, would go on to have a complex and ultimately tragic reign. He struggled to maintain control over his ambitious uncles and increasingly assertive parliament. His later years were marked by a growing authoritarianism, a belief in his own divine right, and an increasing paranoia that alienated many of his nobles. He tried to rule without parliament, exiled powerful lords, and seized their lands. This erratic and tyrannical behavior would eventually lead to another, even more significant challenge to his throne, one that would plunge England into yet another dynastic struggle and change the course of its history once more. Having weathered the storm of the peasants' revolt, remember that terrifying uprising of the common folk. Richard II, though only a teenager at the time, had shown surprising courage. However, as he matured, this initial promise of firm, yet perhaps conciliatory, leadership began to fade, replaced by a growing arrogance, a profound belief in his own divine right to rule, and an increasingly autocratic and erratic temperament. Imagine a king who, rather than seeking compromise, saw any challenge to his authority as a personal affront, almost as if he believed himself chosen by God to rule without question, a belief that rubbed his powerful, independent-minded barons the wrong way. His reign, lasting from 1377 to 1399, became a tense, protracted struggle between a king determined to rule absolutely and a nobility increasingly insistent on constitutional limits, a struggle that would culminate in a dramatic usurpation and the rise of a new dynasty. Richard's personal style alienated many. He preferred the company of a small circle of favorites, often leading to accusations of corruption and undue influence. Much like his grandfather, Edward II, he also pursued lavish courtly displays and spent heavily, further draining the royal coffers. His relationship with Parliament, which had gained significant ground during the 100 Years' War due to the constant need for funds, grew increasingly strained. Parliament frequently challenged his ministers, sought to control royal expenditure, and even attempted to impeach his favorites. Richard, for his part, tried to rule without summoning Parliament when he could, seeing it as an annoying obstacle rather than a necessary partner in governance. The tension escalated in the late 1380s, culminating in the crisis of the merciless Parliament in 1388. A group of powerful lords, known as the Lords Appellant, including Richard's uncle Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, and Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, effectively seized control of the government, accusing Richard's favorites of treason and executing or exiling them. Richard was forced to submit, a humiliating experience that he would never forget or forgive. He may have appeared to reconcile with the appellants, but beneath the surface, a deep-seated resentment festered. He waited for his moment, patiently, biding his time like a spider weaving a web. For a few years after 1388, Richard seemingly adopted a more conciliatory approach, working with his magnates and generally ruling more effectively. However, this period of calm proved to be merely a temporary lull before the storm. From 1397 onwards, Richard unleashed a brutal crackdown, seeking revenge against the Lord's appellant and anyone he perceived as his enemies. He had Gloucester murdered in Calais, exiled the Earl of Arundel, who was then executed, and banished the Earl of Warwick. He began to seize the properties of deceased nobles, confiscate their inheritances, and impose heavy fines, effectively ruling as an increasingly arbitrary and tyrannical monarch. He truly believed he was above the law, a dangerous delusion for any king, especially one who had already faced a revolt from his commoners and a coup from his nobles. The most crucial misstep, the one that directly led to his downfall, involved his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of the immensely wealthy and powerful John of Gaunt. In 1398, Richard exiled both Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, for a private quarrel between them. This seemed a reasonable act to some, but it removed two powerful figures who might have opposed his later actions. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, Richard, instead of allowing Bolingbroke to inherit his vast estates, as was customary, unjustly seized them. This was an act of breathtaking recklessness, a direct attack on the principle of hereditary right and private property, and it alienated even those nobles who had previously remained loyal to the crown. It was a bridge too far, a betrayal of the very feudal system upon which his own power rested. Henry Bolingbroke, now a dispossessed nobleman with a legitimate grievance, saw his opportunity. While Richard was away on a military campaign in Ireland, another disastrous decision, leaving the kingdom vulnerable, Bolingbroke landed in England in July 1399, ostensibly to reclaim his rightful inheritance. Imagine the scene: a powerful nobleman returning from exile, gathering support from disgruntled barons and commoners alike who were fed up with Richard's tyranny. The ease with which Bolingbroke gathered support and marched across England was a testament to how deeply unpopular Richard had become. Richard, upon his hurried return from Ireland, found himself almost entirely isolated. His forces deserted him, and he was eventually captured. In September 1399, in a truly unprecedented event, Richard II was formally deposed by Parliament. The charges against him included tyranny, arbitrary rule, and breaking his coronation oath. Parliament then offered the crown to Henry Bolingbroke, who initially claimed it by right of descent, a rather shaky claim, as there were others with a stronger hereditary right, but then by right of conquest and election by the people. He was crowned King Henry IV in October 1399, marking the beginning of the Lancaster dynasty and a profound shift in English constitutional theory, as a king had now been openly deposed and another chosen by Parliament. It was a moment that underscored the growing power of Parliament and the idea that kingship was not merely about divine right, but also about the consent of the governed. Richard II was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, where he died in early 1400, likely starved to death or murdered. His death, shrouded in mystery, ensured that he would not be a rallying point for future rebellions. The usurpation of Henry IV, however, created a dangerous precedent and left a lingering question mark over the legitimacy of the new Lancastrian dynasty. This challenge to the principle of strict hereditary succession would ultimately lead to decades of bloody civil war in the future, a conflict that would tear England apart and reshape its landscape once more, all because one king pushed his luck a little too far. The usurpation of Richard II, remember him, the king who thought he was untouchable and ended up deposed and dead, ushered in the reign of Henry IV, the first monarch of the Lancaster dynasty, in 1399. Imagine the immense challenge facing this new king. He had seized the throne by force, breaking the sacred principle of hereditary succession, and now he had to legitimize his rule, secure his position against disgruntled nobles, and manage a kingdom still reeling from royal extravagance and political instability. He inherited not a peaceful crown, but a thorny one, perched precariously on a foundation of questionable legitimacy. His reign would be a constant struggle against rebellion and a desperate attempt to prove himself a worthy king. Henry Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, had a strong claim by right of conquest and parliamentary assent, but the bloodline was a bit messy. The true heir by strict primogeniture, the right of the firstborn son, was Edmund Mortimer, the young Earl of March, a fact that would come back to haunt the Lancastrian line for decades. Henry IV was a capable soldier and an intelligent man, but his reign was plagued by ill health and a pervasive sense of insecurity. He knew that if he could depose a king, others could do the same to him. This inherent instability meant that much of his time and resources were spent suppressing various uprisings and conspiracies. It's like being the first person to try a new, somewhat controversial recipe. Everyone's watching to see if it turns out, and if it doesn't, they're quick to point out where you went wrong. The most significant challenges to Henry IV's rule came from within England itself, from powerful noble families who either supported the deposed Richard II or saw an opportunity to advance their own power. The very next year, 1400, saw the Epiphany Rising, a conspiracy by disgruntled nobles loyal to Richard. Though quickly crushed, it set a precedent for the constant threats Henry would face. However, the most dangerous and enduring rebellion came from the powerful Percy family, particularly Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and his fiery son, Henry Hotspur Percy. The Percys had been instrumental in helping Henry IV gain the throne, but they quickly became disillusioned, feeling they had not been sufficiently rewarded and resenting Henry's inability to pay them for their defense of the northern borders against the Scots. They also felt that Henry was too lenient with the troublesome Welsh, who were engaged in their own major rebellion under Owain Glyndwr. Glyndwr's rebellion, which began in 1400, saw the Welsh, tired of English rule, unite under a charismatic leader who proclaimed himself Prince of Wales. This was no minor uprising. It was a full-scale national revolt that spread rapidly across Wales, posing a significant challenge to English authority and tying down valuable resources. Glyndwr proved to be a brilliant guerrilla leader, using the mountainous Welsh terrain to his advantage, frustrating English attempts to suppress him. Imagine the English forces, clad in heavy armor, trying to chase elusive Welsh archers through treacherous mountain passes. It was a costly and protracted conflict that drained Henry IV's treasury and diverted his attention. In 1403, the simmering discontent of the Percys erupted into open rebellion. The Percys allied with Owain Glyndwr and Archibald Douglas, a powerful Scottish lord, forming a formidable coalition. This culminated in the brutal and decisive Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. Imagine the chaos and ferocity of the battle, fought in the stifling summer heat, as two Henrys, the King and Hotspur, led their armies against each other. It was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought between Englishmen on English soil in the medieval period, a true all-in moment for Henry IV's reign. Henry Hotspur, renowned for his courage and military skill, was killed during the fighting, a pivotal moment that effectively broke the back of the rebellion. While the battle was a hard-won victory for Henry IV, it demonstrated the deep divisions and challenges to his rule. Even after Shrewsbury, Henry IV continued to face plots, rebellions, and the ongoing Welsh War. The Archbishop of York, Richard Scrope, even joined a rebellion in 1405, showing the breadth of opposition to Henry's rule. Henry was forced to execute Scrope, an unprecedented act against a senior churchman, further staining his reputation but solidifying his control. The Welsh rebellion, though eventually suppressed, dragged on for years, with Owain Glyndwr famously disappearing without a trace around 1412, becoming a legendary figure in Welsh folklore. Historians still argue whether Glyndwr died in battle, in hiding, or managed to escape to a quiet retirement. Throughout these struggles, Henry IV relied heavily on Parliament for financial support to fund his wars and maintain his government. This continued need for money inadvertently strengthened Parliament's hand, particularly the House of Commons, which gained more influence over legislation and financial grants. It was a transactional relationship, but one that further embedded Parliament into the fabric of English governance, a legacy of the very usurpation that brought Henry to power. Henry IV's health steadily declined in his later years, plagued by various ailments, possibly including leprosy or severe skin disease. His increasing illness led to further internal struggles, particularly with his formidable eldest son, Prince Henry, the future Henry V. The prince, impatient for power and eager to prove himself, often clashed with his ailing father's policies and even tried to take over the government. It's a familiar story, isn't it? The ambitious son, eager to step into his father's shoes, sometimes a little too eager. When Henry IV finally died in 1413, exhausted by years of conflict and ill health, he left a kingdom that was, at last, relatively stable, but deeply indebted and still carrying the stain of his questionable legitimacy. His reign had been one of constant struggle, but he had successfully defended his throne, suppressed numerous rebellions, and ensured the survival of the Lancastrian dynasty. He had paid a heavy personal price for the crown, but he had, against considerable odds, maintained royal authority. The stage was now set for his son, Henry IV, to inherit a kingdom yearning for peace, but also eager for glory. A monarch who would famously turn England's gaze back towards France, seeking to finish the 100 Years' War and silence any lingering doubts about his family's right to rule through a blaze of military triumph. With the troubled and often rebellious reign of his father, Henry IV, finally at an end, Henry V ascended the English throne in 1413. Imagine the hopes resting on the shoulders of this young king, a nation weary of internal strife, yearning for stability, and perhaps a return to the glorious military triumphs of Edward III. Henry V, unlike his ailing and insecure father, was the very embodiment of a medieval warrior king, charismatic, intelligent, pious, and a brilliant military strategist. He had, in his youth, been a rather wild prince, carousing with companions in Eastcheap, a reputation famously immortalized by Shakespeare's Falstaff. But upon taking the crown, he underwent a dramatic transformation, shedding his youthful excesses and embracing his destiny with a serious, almost ascetic devotion. He was now all business, and his business was to assert his legitimate right to rule, and perhaps more importantly, to press England's long-dormant claim to the French throne. Henry V understood that foreign conquest could not only replenish his coffers, but also unite his fractious nobility and silence any lingering doubts about the Lancastrian dynasty's legitimacy. Remember that uneasy feeling many had about his father's usurpation. The 100 Years' War, which had largely sputtered out into a series of truces and minor skirmishes under Henry IV, was ripe for revival. France, at this time, was deeply divided by a bitter civil war between the rival factions of the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, making it particularly vulnerable. It was a chance too good for an ambitious king to pass up. After careful diplomatic maneuvering and failed negotiations with the French, Henry V launched his invasion in 1415. His army landed at Harfleur, a crucial port city, which he painstakingly besieged and captured, a process that cost him valuable time and many men to disease. But his greatest challenge lay ahead: a long march through hostile territory towards Calais, with a much reduced and increasingly ill army, shadowed by a numerically superior French force. It was a risky gamble, a defiant march into the heart of enemy territory, reminiscent of Edward III's campaigns. The defining moment of Henry V's reign, and one of the most famous battles in English history, occurred on October 25th, 1415, at the Battle of Agincourt. Imagine the scene: a muddy, narrow field, flanked by dense woodland, where a tired, sick, and heavily outnumbered English army, perhaps 6,000, 8,000 men, faced a massive, confident French force, estimated at 20,000, 30,000, perhaps even more, composed largely of heavily armored knights. The odds were seemingly insurmountable. Before the battle, Henry V famously delivered a rousing speech, the St. Crispin's Day speech, inspiring his men and promising them eternal glory. Whether or not he actually said, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," it captures the spirit of the moment perfectly. The battle itself was a tactical masterpiece, a testament to English discipline and the devastating power of the longbow. Remember that weapon of English superiority. Henry positioned his archers strategically, forcing the French knights to advance across a narrow, muddy field under a relentless hail of arrows. The French, weighed down by their heavy armor, became bogged down, creating a chaotic, suffocating mass, easy targets for the English archers. The English men-at-arms then charged into the struggling French ranks, using their light axes and mallets to dispatch the overwhelmed knights. It was a massacre. The French suffered catastrophic casualties, including many of their most prominent nobles, while English losses were incredibly light. Historians still argue about the exact numbers, but the disparity was immense, a truly shocking defeat for France, and an astonishing triumph for England. Agincourt was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. It cemented Henry V's reputation as a military genius and instilled fear and respect across Europe. It provided a massive boost to English morale and solidified the Lancastrian dynasty's legitimacy, proving that God was on their side. For the French, it was a national catastrophe, leading to further internal divisions and political paralysis. Henry VIII followed up his victory at Agincourt with further campaigns in France, meticulously conquering territory and establishing English administration. Unlike his predecessors, he was not simply content with raiding. He sought permanent conquest and rule. His ultimate goal was to secure the French crown for his descendants. In 1420, through intense negotiations, he achieved his political masterpiece, the Treaty of Troyes. This treaty was an astonishing diplomatic triumph. It stipulated that Henry V would marry Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the insane French King Charles VI, and that he would be recognized as the regent and heir to the French throne, effectively disinheriting the Dauphin, the legitimate French heir. Upon Charles VI's death, the crowns of England and France would be united under Henry V and his heirs. Imagine the sheer audacity. The King of England would also be the King of France. It seemed that Henry V had achieved what no English monarch before him ever truly had. And the Hundred Years' War was seemingly won. Henry Thorne V was at the zenith of his power, ruling over a vast dual monarchy. But his glorious reign was tragically cut short. In 1422, while still campaigning in France, he contracted dysentery and died at the age of 35. His death, just 2 months before that of his father-in-law, Charles VI, was a crushing blow to English ambitions. His infant son, only 9 months old, became King Henry VI of both England and, theoretically, France. Henry V left behind a formidable legacy: a united English kingdom, a strong and respected monarchy, and vast territories in France. He had instilled a fierce sense of national pride and military confidence. However, he also left a deeply precarious situation: a dual monarchy reliant on the continued success of the war and governed by an infant king, a scenario ripe for instability and eventual decline. The stage was now set for the long, complex, and ultimately tragic reign of Henry VI, where the hard-won gains in France would slowly, inexorably slip away, plunging England into further internal turmoil. The sudden and untimely death of Henry V, remember him, the victor of Agincourt, left England in a profoundly precarious position. Imagine the weight of 2 crowns, English and theoretically French, now resting on the head of an infant king, Henry VI, who was only 9 months old when his formidable father died in 1422. This was an unprecedented situation, and it immediately plunged England and its newly acquired French territories into a long, complex, and ultimately disastrous regency. The carefully constructed dual monarchy, a testament to Henry V's genius, proved to be far too fragile to survive without his direct, powerful leadership. The regency for Henry VI was dominated by his powerful uncles: John, Duke of Bedford, a skilled military commander and administrator who largely governed English-occupied France, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, a more ambitious and often troublesome figure who was Lord Protector of England. These 2 dukes, along with Cardinal Henry Beaufort, shared power, but their differing personalities, priorities, and constant squabbling often undermined the English war effort and bred internal discord. It was like trying to run a massive 2-headed enterprise, with the 2 heads constantly bickering over strategy and resources. Initially, the English cause in France continued to prosper, largely due to the efforts of the Duke of Bedford, who maintained military pressure and secured key alliances. The English still controlled vast swathes of northern France, including Paris, and enjoyed the support of their Burgundian allies. However, the tide of the 100 Years' War began to turn decisively against England with the emergence of an extraordinary figure, Joan of Arc. Imagine the shock and awe among the English, facing down a peasant girl who claimed divine guidance, a young woman who inspired the French people and seemingly turned the course of history. In 1429, Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl, convinced the French Dauphin, the disinherited legitimate heir to the French throne, later Charles VII, that she had been sent by God to save France. She raised the siege of Orléans, a pivotal victory that dramatically boosted French morale and shattered the aura of English invincibility. She then led the Dauphin to Reims, where he was formally crowned Charles VII, an act that deeply legitimized his rule and galvanized French national identity. English forces, who had been on the verge of total victory, suddenly found themselves facing a resurgent, divinely inspired enemy. Historians still argue about the true extent of Joan's military genius versus her immense psychological impact, but her effect on the war was undeniable. Joan's capture by the Burgundians in 1430 and her subsequent trial and execution by the English in 1431, burned at the stake as a heretic, briefly stemmed the French tide. However, her martyrdom only served to further inspire French resistance, solidifying her as a powerful national symbol. The loss of Joan was a propaganda victory for the English, but a profound spiritual and morale booster for the French. The English position in France continued to deteriorate. Financial strain, dwindling manpower, and the relentless pressure from a revitalized French army under Charles VII gradually eroded English control. In 1435, the crucial Treaty of Arras saw the Duke of Burgundy abandon his alliance with England and reconcile with Charles VII. This was a catastrophic blow for England, isolating them and tipping the strategic balance overwhelmingly in France's favor. Imagine the English commanders, realizing their most important ally had just switched sides. It must have felt like the beginning of the end. As Henry VI grew into adulthood, he proved to be a devout and gentle man, but utterly unsuited for the demands of kingship in a turbulent age. He lacked his father's charisma, his grandfather's strategic brilliance, or even the basic political acumen needed to manage his feuding nobility. He was prone to fits of mental illness, often lapsing into periods of catatonia and complete withdrawal, perhaps inheriting a predisposition from his French grandfather, Charles VI. He was more interested in scholastic pursuits and pious contemplation than in governance or war, often described as a simple, good man in a very bad job. This gentle nature, while perhaps admirable personally, translated into weak leadership and an inability to control the powerful factions at court. The English suffered a series of devastating military defeats in France. Normandy, the ancestral home of the English royal family, was lost in 1449 to 1450. By 1453, with the Battle of Castillon, the final major battle of the 100 Years' War, England had lost virtually all its continental possessions, retaining only the port city of Calais. After more than a century of conflict, millions of pounds spent, and countless lives lost, the grand Angevin dream was over. The English kings, who had once claimed the crown of France, were now confined to their island realm. It was a humiliating end to a glorious, yet ultimately futile enterprise. The loss of France, combined with Henry VI's increasing mental instability, the perception of weak and corrupt government, and the bitter factionalism among the English nobility, created an incredibly volatile political climate. The court was rife with rivalries, particularly between the powerful House of Lancaster, Henry VI's own family, and the ambitious House of York, led by Richard, Duke of York. Both houses were descended from Edward III, and both had strong claims to the throne, though the Lancastrians had held it since Henry IV's usurpation. The failure in France left many English soldiers and knights jobless and restless, swelling the ranks of noble retinues. The deep debt incurred by the war and the perceived corruption at court further fueled discontent. When Henry VI suffered a particularly severe mental breakdown in 1453, becoming completely unresponsive and unable to rule, the simmering rivalries finally boiled over. Richard, Duke of York, was appointed Lord Protector, but his ascendancy alarmed the Lancastrian faction, particularly Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry II's fierce and determined wife, who was absolutely committed to protecting her son's inheritance. This moment, when the king became truly incapacitated, marked the beginning of a new internal conflict, a dynastic struggle that would tear England apart for decades, leaving a trail of blood and betrayal in its wake. The complete mental collapse of Henry VI in 1453, remember him, the gentle king who lost France and his mind, finally shattered the fragile peace in England and unleashed the long-simmering dynastic rivalries that had been brewing since the usurpation of Henry IV. Imagine the desperate anxiety at court, a king utterly incapable of ruling, a queen fiercely protective of her infant son's claim, and powerful noble houses with competing interests and armed retinues. This explosive mix ignited a period of brutal civil conflict that would consume England for the next 3 decades, known as the Wars of the Roses. It's a rather romantic name, isn't it? Conjuring images of chivalric knights with floral badges, but the reality was far grimmer. A series of bloody battles, betrayals, and executions that tore families apart and left a generation of English nobility decimated. The conflict primarily involved 2 rival branches of the royal Plantagenet family, both descended from Edward III. The House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, though this symbol became prominent later, comprised Henry VI and his supporters, primarily the established nobility who had benefited from Lancastrian rule. Their strength lay in the north and west of England. Opposing them was the House of York, symbolized by the white rose, led by Richard, Duke of York. Richard was not only immensely wealthy and powerful, but he also had a stronger hereditary claim to the throne than Henry VI, tracing his lineage through an elder line of Edward III's descendants. This fundamental legitimacy question, combined with his resentment over being excluded from Henry VI's inner circle and the perceived misrule of the Lancastrian government, propelled him to challenge the existing order. The initial flashpoint of the conflict was Henry VI's incapacity. When he fell into his catatonic state, Richard, Duke of York, was appointed Lord Protector, giving him control of the government. This infuriated Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's formidable and determined French wife. Imagine her, a queen accustomed to power, seeing her husband sidelined and her son's inheritance threatened by York. She became the de facto leader of the Lancastrian cause, a fierce political and military operator who would stop at nothing to protect her son, Edward, Prince of Wales. Her ambition and tenacity were a driving force throughout the war. When Henry VI briefly recovered in 1455, he reversed many of York's policies, dismissing him from the protectorship and effectively restoring the Lancastrian faction to power. This immediately reignited tensions. The first true battle of the Wars of the Roses, the First Battle of St. Albans, occurred in May 1455. It was a relatively minor skirmish, but significant because it marked the first bloodshed and saw Richard of York emerge victorious, capturing the king and establishing his temporary dominance. The conflict then escalated into open warfare, characterized by periods of intense fighting, followed by uneasy truces, as fortunes shifted back and forth. The battles were often brutal, with little quarter given and high casualties among the nobility. Families were divided, with brothers fighting brothers, and loyalties frequently shifted depending on who held the upper hand. It was a chaotic and unpredictable era where the simple act of choosing a side could mean triumph or swift execution. One of the most significant figures to emerge in this early phase was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, famously known as the Kingmaker. Warwick was a shrewd, immensely wealthy, and militarily powerful magnate who initially sided with the Yorkists. His vast land holdings, extensive network of retainers, and diplomatic skill made him an indispensable ally, capable of swaying the balance of power. He was a master puppeteer, pulling the strings behind the scenes, determining who sat on the throne, at least for a while. A major turning point occurred in 1460 at the Battle of Wakefield. Richard, Duke of York, after initially being recognized as Henry VI's heir through the Act of Accord, decided to press his claim directly for the crown. However, he suffered a crushing defeat at Wakefield at the hands of Queen Margaret's Lancastrian forces. Richard himself was killed, his head gruesomely displayed on the walls of York, with a paper crown, a grim taunt from the triumphant Lancastrians. This seemed like a definitive victory for the Lancastrians, but it merely opened the door for a new, even more formidable Yorkist leader. That leader was Richard's son, Edward, Earl of March, a dynamic, charismatic, and militarily gifted young man. Edward, seeking vengeance for his father's death, immediately took up the Yorkist cause. He was everything a medieval king should be: tall, handsome, a skilled warrior, and an inspiring leader. He proved to be a far more effective military commander than his father, and under his leadership, the Yorkist cause gained unstoppable momentum. In 1461, Edward won a decisive victory at the Battle of Towton, fought in a blizzard, which was one of the largest and bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, resulting in immense casualties. This overwhelming triumph virtually annihilated the Lancastrian army and cemented Edward's claim to the throne. Following Towton, Edward marched on London, where he was formally crowned King Edward IV in March 1461. This marked the first successful overthrow of a reigning dynasty in England since the Norman conquest, a clear demonstration of the raw power and political fluidity of the period. With Edward IV on the throne, the first phase of the Wars of the Roses largely concluded. Henry VI, the deposed Lancastrian king, became a fugitive, eventually captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Queen Margaret and her son, the young Prince Edward, fled into exile, continuing their desperate struggle from abroad. England now had a strong, seemingly legitimate Yorkist king, one who would dedicate his reign to consolidating his new power and attempting to bring stability back to a kingdom ravaged by years of internal conflict. Though the ghost of the deposed king would continue to haunt his reign, promising further chapters in this brutal dynastic saga. With Edward IV now firmly ensconced on the English throne, remember him, the dynamic young Yorkist who seized the crown at Towton. The Wars of the Roses seemed for a brief time to have found a resolution. Imagine the collective sigh of a nation yearning for peace after years of bloody internecine strife. Edward IV, who reigned from 1461 to 1483, was a striking figure, tall, handsome, and charismatic, possessing both military prowess and a shrewd political mind. He set about the difficult task of consolidating his power, restoring order, and healing the deep divisions left by years of civil war. He was a master of propaganda, presenting himself as a strong, rightful king who could bring stability after the chaos of Henry VI's reign. However, the Lancastrian threat, though diminished, still flickered. The deposed Henry VI remained a living symbol for his loyalists, languishing in the Tower of London, and Queen Margaret of Anjou, remember her, the fierce French queen, continued to scheme from exile, desperately seeking to restore her son, Prince Edward, to the throne. Edward IV knew that his hold on power, though strong, was not absolute. He needed to establish his dynasty securely, and part of that involved carefully managing his powerful allies, particularly the enigmatic kingmaker Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick, whose immense wealth and influence had been crucial in placing Edward on the throne, expected to maintain his pivotal role in governance. However, Edward, with his own strong will and a desire to rule independently increasingly sidelined Warwick. The ultimate point of contention came with Edward's secret marriage in 1564 to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner widow with a large and ambitious family. This was a scandalous choice, flying in the face of traditional royal marriages designed to secure political alliances. Warwick, who had been negotiating a marriage alliance for Edward with a French princess, felt deeply humiliated and betrayed. Imagine Warwick, the man who had pulled the strings of royalty, suddenly realizing the king was making his own decisions without consulting him. The Woodvilles, meanwhile, quickly ascended to positions of power and wealth, further alienating the established nobility and the ever-scheming Warwick. The growing rift between Edward IV and Warwick eventually exploded into open conflict. Warwick, feeling slighted and losing influence, remarkably switched his allegiance and formed an unlikely alliance with his former enemy, the exiled Queen Margaret of Anjou. This unprecedented alliance between the kingmaker and the Lancastrian queen was a desperate gamble, but it aimed to restore Henry VI to the throne and, crucially, curb Edward IV's power. In 1470, Warwick and his ally, Edward IV's own estranged brother, George, Duke of Clarence, launched an invasion of England. This audacious move, known as the readaptation of Henry VI, was, for a brief period, successful. Edward IV was forced to flee into exile in Burgundy, and the bewildered, mentally frail Henry VI was dramatically and briefly restored to the throne, pulled from his quiet imprisonment in the Tower of London to act as a Lancastrian puppet king. Imagine the irony. A king twice deposed, now back on the throne, seemingly unaware of the political machinations swirling around him. It was a bizarre twist, a testament to Warwick's incredible influence. However, this Lancastrian resurgence was short-lived. Edward IV, a truly capable military commander, quickly regrouped. With financial and military support from his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, Edward returned to England in 1471. He swiftly crushed his enemies. At the Battle of Barnet in April 1471, Edward decisively defeated and killed Warwick, the kingmaker himself, a pivotal victory that removed the chief architect of his overthrow. Just weeks later, at the Battle of Tewkesbury in May 1471, Edward's forces utterly annihilated the remaining Lancastrian army, led by Queen Margaret and her son, Prince Edward. The young Lancastrian heir was killed, either in battle or immediately afterward. This horrific loss marked the virtual extinction of the direct Lancastrian line. The very night of the Battle of Tewkesbury, or shortly thereafter, the imprisoned Henry VI was likely murdered in the Tower of London. His death removed the last viable Lancastrian claimant and effectively ended the dynastic struggle for the time being. With his enemies vanquished and his claims seemingly unchallengeable, Edward IV settled into a more secure and prosperous second reign, largely free from the constant threat of civil war. Edward IV ruled effectively for the next 12 years, focusing on restoring law and order, stabilizing the kingdom's finances, and promoting trade. He was a shrewd businessman, engaging in profitable merchant ventures himself, and he brought a new sense of administrative efficiency to the crown. His court became a center of Renaissance culture, reflecting his sophistication and patronage of the arts. He had seemingly achieved lasting peace and cemented the Yorkist dynasty. He probably thought, "Finally, a moment to enjoy the fruits of my labor, and perhaps buy some nice new velvet robes." However, the shadow of the usurpation and the brutal means by which Edward had secured and retained his throne would ultimately come back to haunt his line. When Edward IV suddenly and unexpectedly died in 1483 at the age of 40, leaving behind two young sons, the princes in the Tower, and a politically ambitious Woodville family. The precarious nature of dynastic succession in England was once again exposed. The relative stability he had worked so hard to achieve would quickly unravel, leading to one of the most infamous and controversial episodes in English history, and the final bloody act of the Wars of the Roses. The sudden death of Edward IV in 1483, remember him, the strong Yorkist king who had finally brought a semblance of peace after years of the Wars of the Roses, plunged England back into a maelstrom of political intrigue and dynastic paranoia. Imagine the collective gasp of the court, a powerful, relatively young king, gone too soon, leaving behind two vulnerable young sons, Edward Fates, aged 12, and Richard, Duke of York, aged 9. The established order, so painstakingly built by Edward IV, immediately began to fracture, and the stage was set for one of the most infamous and enduring mysteries in English history: the fate of the princes in the Tower and the controversial rise of Richard III. Edward IV had named his younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector for his young son, Edward V. Richard of Gloucester was a capable military commander and administrator, a loyal brother to Edward IV, and seemingly a staunch supporter of the Yorkist line. However, he harbored his own ambitions, and perhaps a deep distrust of the ambitious Woodville family, his late brothers-in-laws, who had rapidly risen in power and influence. He saw them as a threat to his own position and to the stability of the realm. It was a classic power struggle, but with incredibly high stakes. Almost immediately after Edward IV's death, the Woodvilles, led by Queen Elizabeth Woodville and her brother Earl Rivers, attempted to consolidate their power and assert their influence over the young King Edward St. Richard of Gloucester. Fearing they would sideline him and potentially threaten his own safety, acted swiftly and decisively. He intercepted the young king's retinue as it traveled to London, arrested Earl Rivers and other prominent Woodvilles, and took custody of Edward V. He then entered London, presenting himself as the loyal protector of his nephew, saving him from the perceived machinations of the Woodvilles. The two young princes, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were subsequently lodged in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their safety and in preparation for Edward V's coronation. However, as the coronation date repeatedly shifted, and as Richard of Gloucester systematically began to undermine his nephew's legitimacy, a darker narrative began to unfold. Richard, through legal maneuvering and public declarations, began to spread rumors that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid due to a pre-contract with another woman, rendering their children illegitimate. This was a shocking accusation, effectively declaring his nephews bastards and therefore ineligible for the throne. Historians still argue whether this claim had any true legal basis or was simply a convenient fabrication. On June 25, 1483, Parliament, pressured by Richard and his supporters, passed the Titulus Regius, declaring the two princes illegitimate and consequently Richard of Gloucester the rightful king. The very next day, Richard III was crowned King of England. Imagine the disbelief, the whispers, the stark reversal of fortune. A protector had become a king, and two innocent boys had effectively vanished from public view. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in English history. After Richard III's coronation, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were never seen alive again. What happened to them? Did Richard III have them murdered to secure his throne? This is the most widely accepted theory, perpetuated by Tudor historians who demonized Richard, but also supported by circumstantial evidence. Or did they die of natural causes? Or were they perhaps smuggled away to safety by loyalists to reappear later? The lack of definitive evidence, despite centuries of speculation and investigation, continues to fascinate and haunt historians. Their disappearance, however, undoubtedly served Richard III's immediate interests, removing any rallying point for opposition to his rule. Richard III's reign, though short, 1483-1485, was marked by attempts to consolidate his power and gain legitimacy. He enacted some progressive legal reforms, but his usurpation and the lingering suspicion surrounding the prince's fate alienated many. He faced constant conspiracies and disaffection, even from former allies. A major rebellion, led by the Duke of Buckingham, once a key supporter, erupted in 1483, though it was quickly crushed. The fact that a powerful nobleman would turn against a king so recently enthroned underscores the pervasive distrust and instability of the era. The greatest threat to Richard III's reign, however, came from a seemingly unlikely figure, Henry Tudor. Henry was a distant claimant to the Lancastrian throne, tracing his lineage through John of Gaunt's illegitimate line, later legitimized but still somewhat tenuous, and his mother, Margaret Beaufort. He had spent most of his life in exile in Brittany and France, a quiet exile, until circumstances aligned in his favor. He was not a charismatic figure or a renowned warrior, but he was cautious, intelligent, and crucially, had survived the brutal culling of the Wars of the Roses. In August 1485, Henry Tudor, having secured financial and military support from France and a growing number of disaffected English nobles, landed with a small invasion force at Milford Haven in Wales, his ancestral homeland. As he marched eastward, his army swelled with recruits, including many who were weary of constant conflict and distrustful of Richard III. The stage was set for the final, decisive confrontation of the Wars of the Roses on August 22, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. The forces of Richard III and Henry Tudor met. Richard, despite facing a larger and increasingly confident rebel army, fought with characteristic bravery, even leading a desperate charge directly at Henry Tudor. But he was betrayed by some of his key allies, most notably the powerful Stanley family, who dramatically switched sides during the battle. Richard III was killed in the thick of the fighting, famously losing his crown in a bush, or so the legend goes. His body was ignominiously stripped and thrown over a horse, carried back to Leicester. Recent archaeological discoveries, remember that, confirmed the location of his skeleton beneath a car park, a rather undignified resting place for a king, further adding to the dramatic narrative of his fall. The death of Richard III at Bosworth Field marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England for over 300 years. It also effectively brought an end to the Wars of the Roses, concluding a brutal chapter of English history defined by dynastic strife and instability. With Richard dead, Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII on the battlefield, initiating the powerful and long-lasting Tudor dynasty. This new era promised a fresh start, a chance to rebuild a unified kingdom and usher in a new age of stability, though the scars of the past would take generations to truly heal. The dramatic victory of Henry Tudor at Bosworth Field. Remember that decisive battle where Richard III lost his crown and his life, ushered in not just a new king, but an entirely new era for England. Imagine the mixture of relief and apprehension across the land. Relief that the brutal Wars of the Roses were finally over, but apprehension about whether this new king, Henry VII, the first of the Tudor dynasty, could truly bring lasting peace after generations of dynastic bloodshed. His reign, lasting from 1485 to 1509, would largely be defined by his shrewd efforts to secure his precarious throne, restore royal authority, and lay the foundations for the powerful Tudor monarchy that would dominate the next century. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was by strict hereditary right, rather weak, stemming from a legitimized illegitimate line of John of Gaunt and his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a formidable figure in her own right. He knew he could not rely solely on conquest. His first and most crucial move to cement his legitimacy and unite the warring factions was his marriage in 1486 to Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and niece of the deposed Richard III. This symbolic union, blending the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, was a stroke of political genius, effectively uniting the warring houses and ending the dynastic feud. It was a powerful message to a weary nation. The two sides were now one, and the wars were truly over. Finally, you can almost hear the weary nobles sigh. A marriage that actually brings peace, not more war. Henry VII was not a charismatic warrior king like some of his predecessors. Instead, he was a cautious, meticulous, and incredibly astute politician and administrator. He possessed a keen financial mind, obsessed with rebuilding the royal treasury, which had been depleted by years of civil war and royal extravagance. He achieved this through various means: careful management of crown lands, increasing customs duties, and the rigorous, often unpopular, enforcement of feudal dues and fines. His chief financial ministers, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, were notorious for their ruthless efficiency in extracting money, sometimes through dubious legal means, making him a rich king, but not always a popular one. His early reign was still plagued by several challenges to his authority, mostly in the form of pretenders claiming to be one of the princes in the Tower or other Yorkist claimants. The most significant were Lambert Simnel, who impersonated the Earl of Warwick, a nephew of Edward IV who was actually imprisoned in the Tower, and Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes in the Tower. These pretenders, often backed by disgruntled foreign powers or remaining Yorkist sympathizers, tested Henry's resolve. He deftly handled these threats, often through a combination of military force, shrewd espionage, and diplomatic pressure. He famously put Simnel to work in the royal kitchens after capturing him, a rather understated yet effective way of deflating his pretensions. This showed not only his cunning, but also a surprising, and rather rare for the time, streak of mercy. Domestically, Henry VII focused on restoring law and order after decades of chaos. He curbed the power of the overly mighty nobles, strictly enforcing laws against livery and maintenance, the practice of nobles maintaining private armies. He revived and strengthened the Court of Star Chamber, a royal council that dealt with unruly nobles and ensured royal justice, often operating without juries and making it a powerful tool of royal authority. This was a king who understood that true power lay not just in owning land, but in controlling the mechanisms of government and justice. He also cultivated strong alliances through judicious dynastic marriages for his children. His eldest son, Arthur, was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, solidifying an alliance with Spain. His daughter Margaret married James IV of Scotland, laying the groundwork for the future union of the crowns of England and Scotland, though that would be a very long game indeed. These matrimonial alliances were crucial for England's security and its standing in Europe, shifting its focus from continental conquest to diplomatic influence. By the time Henry VII died in 1509, he had achieved his primary goals. He left England a stable, prosperous, and solvent kingdom, with a strong monarchy and a unified ruling house. He had rebuilt the royal treasury, curbed the power of the nobility, and established a system of governance that centralized power in the hands of the king, a critical foundation for the absolute monarchy that his son, Henry VIII, would further develop. The memory of the red rose and white rose, once symbols of bitter division, were now fused into the Tudor rose, a powerful emblem of unity and stability. And so, we bring our journey through the entire history of medieval England to a gentle close. From the Roman legions marching away, leaving a vacuum filled by the Anglo-Saxons, through the rise and fall of Viking invaders, the forging of a nascent English identity under kings like Alfred and Ethelstan, to the seismic shift of the Norman conquest that redefined England's very essence. We've seen the clash of kings and archbishops, the forging of legal systems that still echo today, the grand but costly ambitions of the Plantagenets in France, and the devastating impact of the Black Death that reshaped society from the ground up. We've witnessed the desperate, bloody struggle for the crown during the Wars of the Roses, a conflict that pitted family against family, culminating in the improbable triumph of Henry Tudor, who finally brought an end to centuries of medieval chaos and ushered in a new era. The medieval period, with its knights and castles, its plagues and crusades, its kings and commoners, was a crucible in which England was forged, 1,000 years of triumphs, tragedies, and transformations that laid the very foundations of the nation we know today. As the echoes of medieval trumpets fade into the quiet of the night, and the ghosts of kings and queens, knights and peasants settle back into the long sleep of history, perhaps you can now imagine the whispers of their lives, their struggles, and their dreams drifting through the ancient stones of castles and abbeys, carried on the gentle breeze of time. The grand tapestry of England's past, woven with threads of conflict and creation, now rests peacefully, awaiting the dawn of a new age. Let these stories, rich with human drama and the slow march of progress, lull you into a restful slumber.